Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Obito Sensei in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Obito Sensei Chapter 10. Life goes on. It was another month before Team 7 took another C rank. Once more, they left the village, this time in search of a missing courtier. A servant of the daimyo's court had gone missing, and the Land of Fire's government had been concerned he was kidnapped. This time, the mission held no surprises. The courtier, a portly man named Nobu, was located in short order in a small town near the southern border of the country, unbelievably drunk and raging at a dead-end job that he was worried he would be trapped in for the rest of his life. Obito had been sympathetic, until the man had vomited on him. After that, he'd been immediately delivered to the capital. Team 7 returned to Konoha, and Sakura was ecstatic to share a collective sigh of relief with her teammates. When they got back to the village, the leaves were just beginning to turn. Autumn was coming to the village, hidden in the leaves, bathing their home in a beautiful flurry of red, orange, and yellow. They'd all thought, in their own quiet way, that perhaps every mission would be like their first one. But it wasn't to be. Most C-rank missions, just like D-ranks, which increasingly involved cleaning up the millions and millions of leaves that littered the village, were boring and routine. Few of them were even violent. And so, Team 7 fell into a familiar and comfortable pattern. ####. 35 days after Sakura had retrieved Haiden's heart, Naruto snapped his fingers. "Shoot," he said, the noodles in his mouth rendering the word garbled and barely understandable. "I totally forgot. Something important, Naruto." Obito looked over, and so did Sakura. They were having lunch together at a ramen place that Naruto loved. Sakura didn't really understand why he liked the food so much, but it definitely wasn't bad. Maybe noodles just weren't her thing. "Kinda," he said with a slurp. "My dad wanted to meet me later. He wanted to see how I was doing with the raised non." "How's that going?" Sakura asked. Her teammate had carried water balloons everywhere he went for a long time now, furiously trying to pop them with his chakra. It made her feel a little bad, but after seeing all the trouble Naruto had gone through trying to learn the jutsu, the gap between them had seemed a little less impossible to breach. Even after more than 2 months of trying, Naruto still hadn't managed to burst the balloon. Naruto stuck out his tongue. "Bad," he said. He was grinning through. Sakura was coming to admire that about Naruto. It didn't matter if he was frustrated or not, he always grinned. It didn't seem false to her either. Her teammate was just happy, and didn't let things get him down. She hoped he'd always be that way. "What about you?" Sasuke asked, taking a subdued slurp of his ramen, and Sakura turned to him. "How's your kenjutsu going, Sakura? I haven't seen much of it recently." That was true, to Sakura's regret. Obito had been focusing them all on controlling their chakra with more precision since they'd gotten back from their first mission outside the village. Maybe to help Naruto learn the raised non, maybe just to expand their skill set and prepare them for more advanced training. It could be hard to tell with their sensei sometimes. He was friendly, and he frequently joked with them, but he seemed to prefer letting them figure things out on their own, with a little helpful prodding. Teaching them to walk on water had been a prime example of that. Obito had met them by one of the rivers that ran through the wilderness of the village's territory, watching them with a coy grin. "Follow me," he'd said, striding right across the water and then turning to watch them expectantly. It wasn't very far or deep, and so they'd all done as he asked, wading through the water after him and coming out on the other side. "Well done," he'd said, and Naruto had laughed. All they'd done was walk through some water, what was he congratulating them for? Obito had just grinned, and walked back to the other side of the bank. "All right," he'd smirked. "Now come back across without getting your knees wet." That had been an interesting day. It had taken all of them a couple hours to figure out how to navigate the river, with its constant current and occasional swells. Sakura, to her astonishment, had been first to manage it. She'd considered asking for help, but hadn't wanted to be the first one to do so. So instead, she'd tried to look at it as logically as possible. The reason you sank into water is because you were denser than it, she'd thought. Really simple physics, and for that reason apparently inescapable. So, how could a ninja use chakra to escape that universal rule of density? She couldn't alter her own density. At least, she was pretty sure of that. Wasn't the henge just a physical transformation, in a similar manner? But you couldn't alter your density or weight with a henge, only your physical shape. If you turned yourself into a giant shuriken, you'd be as aerodynamic as one, but still just as heavy as yourself. Even if she turned herself into a log or something that would float on water, she'd still sink. So it couldn't be modifying her own density. The epiphany came to Sakura slowly, as she watched Sasuke pace, sending stutters of chakra into his feet and blowing small gaps in the grass of the bank. He must have picked something up with his Sharingan, she'd realized. She couldn't alter her density, or the water's. That meant if water walking was something basic enough that Obito expected them to be able to learn it, it had to be based on a simple principle. All she had to do was use her chakra to provide a buoyant buffer, something that would push her up without actively disrupting the liquid. Like a lifeguard's buoy, but on her feet. Sakura had gone to the bank and started experimentally dipping her foot in, feeling the play of chakra down her leg and trying to direct it as neatly as possible. Naruto had tried to walk across the river on his hands, his legs waving in the air and his head submerged, and Obito had leapt to him and pushed him over for his trouble, laughing as Naruto had come up soaked and squawking. Up, down. Sakura had spent 5 minutes just pushing her foot in and out of the water, squinting and trying to control the exact amount of chakra being ejected from the bottom of her foot. Too much and it blew a hole in the water like a gust of air. Too little and her foot slipped right in with a little resistance, as though the water were pushing back. But after 5 minutes, she'd managed to make it so that one foot would settle firmly on the surface, even if she put all of her weight on it. So she'd done the same thing for the other, and then slowly waddled across the river, one foot barely an inch in front of the other the whole way. That had been exciting, even exulting. The way Obito had smiled at her had made her feel unbelievably proud. But Kenjutsu wasn't like that at all. Kenjutsu was frustrating. Even with both her sensei and her father working with her, Sakura felt like she wasn't making progress. Bad, she said, mimicking Naruto, and Sasuke chuckled. It wasn't mean. At least, she didn't think so. He'd always been harder to read. Well, he said with a shrug. I guess you need to spend more time with Obito. Sensei, Obito said with a grin, and Sasuke shot him an insolent look. Obito Sensei, little guy. Of course, Sasuke said with a tiny smirk. And what do you think of my suggestion, Sensei? Actually, Obito said, I think I might be too advanced a partner for Sakura. Sakura looked over to him, feeling her stomach sink. Did Obito mean that she wasn't skilled enough to learn? She hadn't thought her sword skills were that bad. She'd bought a practice blade with some of the bounty money she'd earned, and Obito had been teaching her various forms and footwork. Had she been that useless with it? Don't get the wrong idea, he said, catching her look, and Sakura sighed in embarrassment. You've definitely got potential. But I think you might learn a bit quicker with someone else. It's been so long since I studied the basics that I've been practically learning with you. He laughed. It's good when that stuff becomes so second nature you barely remember it anymore, but it makes for a lousy teacher, right? So, he meant it when he said he was too advanced for her. It wasn't an excuse. Sakura looked down into her bowl. That's why, Obito continued, I'm thinking that Sakura should start out learning with someone else. Sakura looked up at him, a little confused. When you've got the basics down, then we can pick back up, and I can teach you some trickier stuff. Someone else? Sasuke asked before Sakura could. Who do you mean? One of Guy's students, Obito said, and Sasuke winced. Oh. Naruto said, almost jumping out of his seat. The green guy. Sakura wasn't sure who he was talking about. Green guy? She asked Obito, and her sensei grinned. Yup, he said. Might guy. Konoha's premier taijutsu specialist, and a very green guy. Hashtag. Obito. Might guy shouted at the top of his lungs when they arrived at the field, before jumping into a leaping kick and driving his foot straight through their sensei's head. Sakura and Naruto stumbled backwards, falling on their backs in shock as the lunatic in green spun and tried to kick Obito in half. The second attack was just as useless as the first. Obito just watched him in amusement, crossing his arms as the kick passed harmlessly through him. Sasuke was much the same. Their teammate just sighed, taking a seat on his own and watching the show. "Good to see you too, Guy," Obito grinned, and Sakura watched in shock as Guy attacked one last time, driving a series of punches too fast for her to see through Obito's chest. He really was very green, she thought. Everything he wore was green. It looked like it might be some kind of jumpsuit, with a matching top and bottom. Even his sandals were a dim, grassy color. Guy declared, coming to a stop. "As ever, you are elusive, Obito." He smiled. He must have brushed his teeth several times a day, Sakura thought, because they were blindingly white. "Your reflexes are superb as always." Her sensei rolled his eyes. "Like I said the other 58 times, Guy, it's automatic. By now if I see you coming, I just turn the Kamui on just in case." "Well, that is a wonderful precaution." Guy gave the Uchiha a thumbs up, and Sakura's teacher smiled. "But even with your foresight, one day, I will strike you." "Looking forward to it," Obito laughed. "But I'm not here to spar today." "If not to spar," Guy asked with a sly look, "then why?" He glanced around at Sakura and her teammates, all of whom were still on the ground. "Perhaps there is a lesson the Green Beast can teach your students that you cannot." "Well, something like that," Obito said, and Guy clashed his fists together in excitement. "I knew it," he said. "Well, we shall start with 400 push-ups, at least. Your cousin looks a little weedy." Sasuke made a vaguely offended sound, and both Naruto and Sakura snorted. "And then dash." Actually, Obito cut his friend off, and Guy frowned. "We're just here for Sakura today." "Sakura?" Guy asked, and Sakura scrambled to her feet and gave a slight bow. Guy looked her up and down. "Well, she seems enthusiastic enough." "Her taijutsu is fine," Obito said. "Right now, she's trying to learn kenjutsu." "Ah." Guy's eyes lit up. "You do not seek a master, you seek another student." "Precisely," Obito said. He chuckled. "Always get right to the heart of it, don't you?" "I prefer to be direct," Guy declared, before returning his attention to Sakura. Even just being watched by him was intimidating, Sakura thought. The man had so much energy it was like he was going to burst at any moment, and having all of his focus on her made her fill up with nervous jitters. "So, you intend to be a swordswoman?" he asked, and Sakura was suddenly unsure. "I think so," she said, and Guy cocked his head. "I didn't have any interest in the academy, but I picked up a sword on our first C rank, and..." "Ah." Guy nodded. "That nasty business." He was still bursting with energy, but he grew a little more somber. Sakura could see then that he was more than just a slightly insane martial artist. There was a bit of commiseration in Guy's eyes as he looked at her. What you find interest in while learning and what you find comforting on the battlefield can be very different. If a blade felt good in your hands while you fought, then a blade is what you should learn. He smiled again, his somber aura blown away in an instant. After all, when should you be most comfortable, if not when fighting for your life? Sakura blinked. "I guess you're right," she said, and the man's grin grew wider. "Come, then," he said, gesturing grandly to the west. "I will introduce you to my students. I believe among them you will meet someone who will help you find that comfort." Team 7 walked with him. Guy occasionally threw more blows at Obito, all of which passed through him. Their sensei ignored all the attacks, not even pausing when he was speaking. "Do you ever think you're actually gonna hit him?" Naruto asked after about a minute, and Guy grinned at him. "Of course," he declared. "All shinobi have a weakness. Even your father, young man, as hard as that might be to believe." "Oh?" Sasuke asked. "And what would Obito's be then?" "His ghostly nature is certainly a challenge," Guy said, stroking his chin, and Obito mimicked the action good-naturedly. "But it is a tiring technique, and my endurance outstrips his own. I am not called the Green Beast for nothing." "I'm pretty sure you are, actually," Obito said. "Didn't you come up with that name?" "I did," Guy said proudly. but that is because I have the speed, strength, and stamina of a beast. It was the only fitting appellation. He quirked an eyebrow. And perhaps you are simply jealous that you have not come up with an equally catchy name, Mangekyo no Obito. Of course not. Obito declared, and Guy laughed. Sakura grinned, her sensei was sweating. I recall all your failed attempts as surely as you do not, Obito, Guy said, and Team 7 found itself leaning in. Obito the Phantom. Obito, the Killer Ghost. Obito, of the Bloody Eye. Obito dash. Hey. Obito interrupted, just as Naruto began to break down laughing. That's your team over there, right? Sakura looked where Obito was looking and found 3 teenagers watching them approach from the trees. They were all a little older and taller than her and her team. There were 2 boys and 1 girl, the same composition as most of the teams the academy put out. One of the boys looked like a miniature version of Guy, to Sakura's surprise. They didn't have similar faces, but they had identical outfits and haircuts. The other was unmistakably a Hyuga, his milky eyes watching them approach without any obvious emotion. He had long, flowing black hair, and his hands were covered in bandages. The last, the girl, was a couple inches taller than her companions, and wore a simple white vest. Her hair was in a bun, and a large scroll, as big around as her, was strapped to her back. The training ground they stood in was torn to pieces, small craters punched in the ground everywhere and shuriken, kunao, and other weapons littering the whole place. A target post had been torn in half, the bottom 3 feet of it sticking dismally out of the ground. Ah, Sensei! The boy who looked like Guy shouted. You have returned with company. Indeed, Lee. Guy shouted back. This is Mangekyo no Obito. There wasn't a lick of hesitation, Lee charged straight at Obito and tried to tackle him, soaring right through his chest. Sakura's sensei sighed. So, now you've got a little doppelganger? He asked, sounding weary, and Sakura resisted the urge to laugh. He wasn't like this when you started out. I did not see Guy-sensei's wisdom, starting out. Lee said as he finished rolling to his feet, turning to face Obito. But he was absolutely correct, if you can strike a ghost, you can strike anything. He was even louder than his master. Sakura finally broke down with a laugh, and Lee glanced at her. To her astonishment, he blushed. Had a boy ever blushed at her? Sakura froze, totally unsure of how to react, but Obito saved her from having to worry about it. I'm not a ghost, he said glumly. Why don't you introduce us to your teammates? Of course. Lee said, as both his companions approached. This is Niji. He said, pointing to the Hyuga. A genius in the gentle fist, who I will no doubt surpass. Niji laughed, it sounded a little mean, Sakura thought, but his face seemed nice enough. Not anytime soon, he said, and Lee huffed. He looked them over. So, Sasuke Uchiha and Naruto Namikaze, he said, his voice a little low, and Sakura's teammates straightened up at the attention. Your sensei is Mangekyo no Obito, is he? Seems that way, Naruto said with a frown, and Sakura watched from the side, wondering why Niji had focused solely on her teammates and completely ignored her. That's good, Niji said. It would be a shame to defeat you if you had a substandard teacher. People would consider it an excuse. Sasuke stepped forward, an invisible charge passing between him and the Hyuga, and Sakura blinked, wondering what was happening. What do you mean? She asked, and Niji stared at her. I don't know you, he said, his voice curious, and Sakura blinked again. I'm Sakura Harano, she said, extending her hand, and after a moment Niji took it in a firm handshake. It's nice to meet you, Sakura Harano, he said, inclining his head slightly. I have no interest in defeating you. What a strange guy. Well, that's fine, Sakura said, trying to dispel the tension. I've got no interest in being defeated by you, so I guess we're on the same level. Niji laughed. Indeed. He released her hand. To Sakura's relief, the nascent tension was gone. Ah. Lee said, some of his thunder stolen by his teammates' words. And this is Tenten. The tall girl stepped forward with a smile. Nice to meet you all, she said with a wave, and Sakura smiled back. What brings you to our little corner of the woods? Tenten! Guy shouted, and the girl jumped. Sakura here plucked a sword from the hands of an enemy, and it sung to her. Sakura said, looking over to the man. Obito was face-palming behind him. I wouldn't quite put it that way, Master Guy. Ah. Guy stepped back. My apologies. How would you put it? Sakura's eyes went wide, and she felt her face go red. A dash. She picked it up, Naruto said suddenly, and whacked a shuriken right out of the air. Tenten looked surprised, nodding slowly, and Naruto glanced at Sakura. She was good with it, and she'd been trying to get better, he said, and now Sakura was the one blushing. I bet she could be real good, with someone to practice with. Ah, Tenten said with an understanding tone. You think she'd be a good training partner, Sensei? A wonderful one. Guy declared. She is young, and persistent. I believe you and she would do well to learn from one another, Tenten. He grinned. Not to mention, it would force Obito to spend more time around me. Eventually, he will slip up. Obito shook his head, and Sasuke patted him on the shoulder with mock compassion. Tenten laughed. Well, I suppose it couldn't hurt, she said, and Sakura smiled at her tone. Besides, you guys are all obsessed with your fists anyway, it would be nice to have some practice with someone else who appreciates a sword. She looked at Sakura. Do you appreciate a sword? I don't know, Sakura said with a shrug. She gave Naruto an appreciative look, and the blonde grinned and scratched the back of his head. But I want to find out. Good enough for me, Tenten declared. Let's get started. ####. 74 days after her first C rank, Sakura knocked Tenten's sword out of her hands. They both watched it go, equally startled, as it spun off into the air and buried itself several inches into the dirt. Tenten looked down at her and Sakura looked back, very aware, as always, of the height difference between them. Her sword, one she'd borrowed from her training partner, was still in her hand, standing there holding a naked blade with Tenten disarmed in front of her. Sakura didn't know what to do. The older girl smiled. Nice one, she laughed, and the tension of the moment dissolved without ceremony. It was a sunny day, approaching the afternoon, and the two of them were alone in one of Konoha's hundreds of training grounds. She turned, walking after the sword, and drew it out of the earth. I didn't see that coming. You weren't gripping the sword, Sakura said. One of the first things that Tenten had taught her beyond the basics of improving her footwork and form was that it was critical for a shinobi to always keep hold of their weapon with chakra, otherwise, a strong blow would easily tear the weapon out of their hands. The only reason she wouldn't have been doing that. Well, I'm still going a little easy on you, Tenten said with a grin, flourishing her blade. But now that you've disarmed me, you've proved that's not necessary anymore. She sheathed it behind her back, placing it back in the ceiling scrolls she carried everywhere with her. Here, gimme it back. We're done for now. Sakura gingerly returned the sword, keeping the blade facing away from Tenten. What do you mean? I mean, you're a natural, Tenten said, and Sakura blushed. Well, maybe natural is the wrong word cause you didn't pick it up right away. She turned, waving for Sakura to follow her. They walked together to the other side of the field, towards the target posts opposite the dirt pit they'd been practicing in. I was frustrated getting started, Sakura admitted, and Tenten chuckled. Yeah, that was obvious, she said, and Sakura laughed as well. But it's only been a month and some and you've already gotten to the point where I'm going to have to start using chakra for our spars. She glanced down at her. That's impressive. I get the feeling that you could have done whatever you put your mind to, you're smart enough, and you put the work in. Well. Sakura looked south, over to the back of the Hokage monument. I don't know if I would have taken things this seriously. Yeah, Tenten grinned. We're kinda alike, you know. What? Sakura asked, and her sparring partner shrugged. Tenten was older than her, and, though Sakura wouldn't admit this out loud for fear of being teased, she thought she was much cooler as well. She'd never considered a similarity between the two of them besides their kenjutsu. We both ended up on interesting teams, and it pushed us in interesting directions. They came to a stop about 30 meters from the target posts, and Tenten set down her scroll. They both pushed us. I don't know about that, Sakura said quietly. I don't mean like forced. Tenten removed several dozen shuriken from the scroll, laying them out in neat rows. I mean that being near that made us want to be better. So we wouldn't fall behind. She looked back at Sakura. You're on a team with an Uchiha prodigy and the Hokage's son. You must have been worried about that. She was still worried about that. Sakura just nodded. I ended up with Niji and Lee, Tenten continued. Niji might be from the branch house, but he's a prodigy just like Sasuke. Maybe even better. She laughed. And Lee might be complete garbage at ninjutsu and genjutsu, but he took that and made his taijutsu better than it has any right to be. He's already way beyond the average Chunin there. With those guys on either side of me, I felt like I needed something of my own. She threw 7 shuriken, and scored 7 direct hits on the various targets scattered across the posts, bullseyeing each one without apparent effort. Sakura smiled. So you made it so you'd never miss, she said, and Tenten nodded. I made it so I'd never miss, she said, and punctuated the point with another 10 shuriken and another 10 bullseyes. She wasn't kidding, Sakura thought. She and Tenten had been training their kenjutsu together for several weeks now, and whenever they finished Tenten would practice her aim. In all that time, Sakura had never once seen her miss. Tenten threw another brace of shuriken, and 2 of them angled into each other, deflecting off at wild angles to score bullseyes on the sides of the posts. What do you mean by branch house? Sakura asked. She hadn't heard the term before. Tenten's eyes narrowed. The Hyuga aren't like the other clans, she said, hurling yet more shuriken, along with a couple kunai. Hit, hit, hit. Sakura didn't know how she managed it. There's the main family, and the branch family. I don't know what determines it, but if you're branch family like Niji, you're basically a servant to the main family. She started walking forward to retrieve her tools, and Sakura followed, interested in hearing more. Niji's father is the twin brother of the head of the clan right now, but he's still branch. Maybe he was born second or something. That means Niji is too. The head of the Hyuga? Sakura asked. Wouldn't that be Hinata's father? She hadn't seen any of her classmates, Hinata included, in several weeks, and sometimes she found herself missing them. Sakura hadn't been incredibly close to anyone in her class, even Ino or Hinata, but it had been nice to be part of the group regardless. Yeah, Tenten nodded. She's Niji's closest cousin. You know, twin dads. She screwed up her face. That must be kinda weird. They spar a lot, he always wins. She laughed. He doesn't seem to mind, he doesn't hate her or the main branch or anything like that, but he definitely likes beating them. I guess to him fighting Hinata is like fighting the whole concept of the clan. They fell into a comfortable silence, and Sakura picked up several kunai of her own. Hitting a bullseye from 100 feet away wasn't impossible for her, but there was no way she could match Tenten there. Her first knife overshot and buried itself high on the post, the second didn't have enough power, and fell short by a foot. She huffed, and Tenten giggled. I don't know how you do it, she said, and Tenten shrugged. You'd get it, with time. I've been doing this for more than a year now, she said, proving the point with another perfectly thrown knife. Like I said, you're smart enough to figure out just about anything, I think. She looked back, the sun shining in her eyes and making her squint. Isn't that why you became a shinobi? Sakura felt a chill run down her back, and Tenten quirked her head. She'd shown something, Sakura realized, in her eyes or her body language. What? Tenten asked, and Sakura frowned. Why did you? She asked, and Tenten blinked. Become a shinobi, I mean. Tenten looked away from the blinding sun, and from Sakura. Well, I don't have a family. There wasn't anyone pushing for me to become a ninja. Though I guess a lot of orphans become ninja because it's the best option for them. But when I was young, I heard stories about the Sunin, and Tsunade. She gave a sheepish smile. I guess that inspired me. The Sunin. Sakura only knew the basics, 3 incredibly famous shinobi from the Leaf who'd been instrumental in the Second War. Jiraiya, Orochimaru, and Tsunade. She had no idea where any of them were now. Tsunade invented the medical division, Tenten said, and Sakura started. She hadn't known that. And she was the strongest woman alive, supposedly. So I wanted to be a medic, and I wanted to be strong. She chuckled. But when I ended up with Guy Sensei, it became obvious really quickly that I didn't have the control or patience to be a medic. I kept killing everything I was given to practice on, fish and stuff. I couldn't even separate coffee from cream without blowing the cup up. I guess I have violent chakra. Like the balloon, Sakura thought. Naruto had finally managed to pop the water balloon just 2 weeks before, circulating his chakra through the water so violently that the balloon burst. He'd been exuberant, until he'd come back the next day. His father had given him a rubber ball about the size of his hand upon receiving the news, apparently. Now, he had to break an even harder material without help from the water. Sakura wondered what kind of jutsu could possibly require such precise and directed chakra control, without even an elemental affinity. She snapped back to the present as Tenten continued. I was heartbroken at first, but Guy Sensei told me that Tsunade probably hadn't set out to become a great medic from the start, she'd just ended up where she was best. She plucked the last of the shuriken from the post, sealing it back into her scroll. So, I started messing around with ninja tools, and with fuinjutsu, and I ended up with this. And now, I'm going to follow it as far as it'll take me. In that way, I think I'm still following the person who inspired me. So, Tenten had become a shinobi because someone had inspired her. That made sense to Sakura, plenty of people did things for that reason. Why do you ask, anyway? Tenten said, and Sakura sighed. I didn't have anything like that, she admitted. Obito Sensei asked me, the first day, why I'd become a shinobi. And I didn't know. I didn't have an answer. I just ended up as one. Well, that's probably what happens to most people, Tenten said, and Sakura blinked, her internal condemnation drying up under Tenten's frankness. It's a hidden village, after all. If you don't know what to do, you become a ninja. Both your parents are, right? Sakura nodded, and Tenten smiled. You looked worried. Relax. If you grew up with 2 ninja as your only example, what else could you have done? Everyone ends up where they are because of who's around them, not because they're born with a purpose or something. Have you been worried about that this whole time? A little, Sakura admitted, suddenly feeling silly. Ah, it's all right, Tenten said, smacking her shoulder. She did that a lot. The older girl was more physical than anyone else Sakura had met. You're figuring it out now, right? That's all you can do sometimes. Sakura, at that moment, felt a deep and abiding appreciation for the older girl. Thanks, she said haltingly. Tenten, we're friends, right? Tenten gave her a puzzled look. We've been hanging out for a month and clashing swords almost every day. Did you think we weren't friends? Sorry, Sakura said, mortified. I just dash. Forget it. Tenten smiled. Grab another sword. We still have some sunlight. She drew her own weapon, a short glaive, and paced back from Sakura, putting about 20 feet between them. This time, you're getting disarmed. I guarantee it. Grateful and more than a little relieved, Sakura reached for the scroll, drew a Chokyuto out, and leapt back into a ready position as the sun continued to set behind her. ####. When the last of the leaves fell, over 100 days after their first C rank, Naruto finished the raise non. Sakura. Sakura jerked and looked to her left, out her bedroom window. She found Naruto there, staring at her with an enormous grin plastered on his face. Only her teammate's head was visible, peeking around the side of the windowsill. He was standing on the side of her apartment. Naruto. She set down the book she'd been reading on her bed, standing up and walking over to the window. She'd left it open to enjoy some of the cool winter air. Konoha didn't get very cold, even in December, though it had snowed once in her memory. What are you doing? I figured it out. He declared proudly, and Sakura heard someone start to climb the stairs to her room below. Her mother was the only one home right now, so it was certainly her. "I got it." "Got what?" she asked. "You don't mean dash the raise non?" Sakura was taken aback. It had only been 10 days before that Naruto had managed to burst the rubber ball with his chakra, and move on to what he had been told was the final step. He'd been given an empty balloon, and told to form his chakra within it without popping it, the complete reversal of the previous exercises. Had he really figured it out that quickly? "Congratulations," she said after a moment of hesitation, and Naruto's smile grew wider. "Kmin," he said, and the footsteps reached the top of the stairs. "I'm gonna grab Sasuke, and show my dad. Do you wanna come with?" She blinked. Naruto had come to her first, instead of his parents or Sasuke. Why? She must have just been closest, Sakura thought. That's what made the most sense. "Sakura." Her mother pushed open the door behind her, and Sakura half-turned, looking over her shoulder. "Everything all right?" She spotted Naruto over her shoulder. "Oh!" she exclaimed. "Naruto, what are you doing out there?" The blonde looked sheepish. "It was the quickest way up," he said, and Sakura's mother laughed. "Well, don't scuff the wall, all right? You'll be the one paying for it." She was wearing a nice necklace, Sakura noticed, one of the things she'd bought with the bounty money from Haiden. Sakura had never really understood jewelry, but she had to admit the necklace with its silver chain and sapphire stone was really quite pretty. "What did you come for?" Sakura's family had only met Naruto a couple times, but they'd always hit it off. Her teammate was infectious in his enthusiasm and good cheer, and the fact he was the Hokage's son probably helped. Naruto just shrugged in response to Mabuki's question. "Just wanted to show Sakura something," he said. "I've got a new jutsu." "Well, that certainly sounds interesting," Sakura's mother said, glancing at her and wiggling her eyebrows. Sakura stared back without comprehension, and her mother laughed. "Go on then. Just close the window behind you, would you?" Her mother closed the door, and when Sakura hopped out the window, sticking herself to the wall alongside Naruto, she gently closed the window. They made their way to the Uchiha compound, chattering about trivialities along the way. Konoha in the winter was always an interesting sight. The multitude of forests that peppered the village were bereft of their leaves, robbing their home of much of its color and vitality, and thick clouds frequently hung low over the village. Its citizens countered the gloominess by hanging more colorful tapestries in the streets and planting vibrant winter fruits and trees on the rooftops, but there was still more gray than green. The only exception were the grand trees planted by the first Hokage, dozens of meters tall and furnished with leaves throughout the year. No matter the weather or circumstances, the founding trees of Konoha would never wither. Sakura had always wondered why the Uchiha's home was on the outskirts of the village, well away from any other residential districts. They'd been one of the founding clans, but they were more isolated than any of them. Had that been their decision, or someone else's? The compound had a couple different entrances, but the largest was the southward facing, and that was the one Naruto and Sakura approached from. There was a young boy sitting outside it, maybe 4 or 5 years old, whittling something into a tree, and he watched them enter with a solemn expression. The Uchiha built differently from the rest of Konoha. They had wide, cobbled streets, and their homes were more concrete than wood. Naruto seemed to know the way, and so Sakura followed him. She'd never seen Sasuke's home before. They passed several Uchiha, all of whom glanced at them, but no stopped to speak with them. In a little more than a minute, they came to a squat and wide house, only 1 story tall but still larger than Sakura's own home. Naruto knocked on the door, and then let himself inside. "Sasuke," he called, and in response a woman stuck her head through a door frame at the end of the hall. Sakura had only met Mikoto Uchiha twice in all her time with her team, and just like last time, she couldn't take her eyes off the burns on the woman's otherwise beautiful face. "Naruto?" the woman asked. "He's out back." She shifted her gaze to Sakura, her scars crinkling. "Hello, Sakura. What's this about?" Naruto figured out the raise non, Sakura said self-consciously, and Mikoto clicked her tongue in surprise. He wanted Sasuke to be there when he shows his father. Well, who can blame him? That's quite the achievement. Mikoto gestured over her shoulder. Out back, like I said. Congratulations, Naruto. Thanks. Naruto bolted past her, while Sakura did her best to give Sasuke's mother a respectable distance as she made her way down the hallway. Mikoto watched her go as she did, and Sakura slowed, wondering if she'd done something wrong. Obito tells me your Kenjutsu has improved, Mikoto said, and Sakura blinked, turning to look at the woman directly. She was watching Sakura with something she couldn't identify. I'm a swordswoman myself. We should meet sometime. Sakura felt a gear in her head catch. There was a cold sweat on the back of her neck. Mikoto's gaze, even without her Sharingan active, was intense. Pardon me, ma'am. Naruto and Sasuke already know this, Sasuke's mother said with a frown. But you are on a team, more than any other, that may have to face a Sharingan one day. It would benefit you to learn how to fight it. I don't understand, Sakura admitted. Mikoto shook her head, the intensity vanishing. Don't worry about it, for now, she said with a faint smile. Just consider my offer, if you would. Of course, Sakura said, trying to understand what had just happened. Of course I will. I promise. Mikoto shooed her away with a grin, and Sakura left, stepping into the backyard to find Sasuke and Naruto waiting for her. Her Uchiha teammate had worked up a sweat. There was a tree covered in small burns and ninja tools behind him. What happened? Naruto asked, and Sakura shook her head. Nothing, she said, wondering if that was true. Sorry I took a second. All right, Sasuke said. Let's go then. He grinned at Naruto. I'd like to see this jutsu, if you've really figured it out. They left the compound together, making their way to the Hokage's office. It was one of the tallest and most central buildings in Konoha, visible from any rooftop in the village, and Sakura had never been inside before. They made their way through one of the side doors, Naruto nodding at a watching Chunin, and climbed a twisting staircase that ran through the whole building. 7 floors up, and they came to a hall, and Naruto confidently stepped down it, quietly whistling a tune to himself. There was Numbu outside the office, guarding the heavy double doors, and he watched them approach with a mask marked with a minimalistic hawk. When Naruto reached for the door, he shook his head. Meeting, he said, and Naruto frowned. Give him a minute, kid. Naruto stuck his tongue out, to Sakura's shock. It'll only be a minute, he said, and the umbu shifted. Sakura couldn't believe that her teammate was willing to talk back to a senior ninja like that, even if he was the Hokage's son. That was rude, right? She glanced at Sasuke. He wasn't showing an emotion of any kind. It was impossible to know if he felt the same way. But the umbu made no move to stop them when Naruto pushed the door open, so Sakura didn't say anything. Sensei's old students are always causing trouble, the Hokage said as they entered, looking up from his desk as they entered. There were 5 other people in the room with him. Sakura only recognized 2 of them. The third Hokage, who had retired before she was born but was still a man with a very imposing presence, and Kushina Uzumaki, Naruto's mother. The other 3 were a man and a woman with gray hair and severe expressions, and another middle-aged man with spiky black hair and deep frown lines. 2 scars ran from above and below his left eye to the side of his face, ending near his ears. Of all the adults in the room, he was the one who watched them with the most intensity. The Hokage made eye contact with his son, and Sakura felt a flash of guilt. They shouldn't be here right now, they'd intruded on something important. All the adults in the room were looking at them now, all curiously, some with confusion, and the Hokage finished his thought as he pinned his son with his brilliant blue eyes. Until they cause an actual issue, we're inviting them, he declared, and the room relaxed. We'll revisit the issue in May. He straightened up. Naruto. Something wrong. Who let you in? Kushina demanded, and Naruto shrugged. We've talked about this before, Naruto. You can't just walk into your father's office whenever you want. Hawk let me in, Naruto said with a grin. How could he be so confident, with his family, a previous Kage, and other important shinobi staring at him? Sakura really couldn't understand him sometimes. I got it. You got it? The Hokage asked, and his son nodded. He smiled faintly. Sakura couldn't remember ever seeing the Hokage smile before. The few times she'd seen him, he'd always been so serious and solemn, but he had a smile like Naruto's, one that was bright and guileless. Well, it took longer than Obito thought it would, but that's still good to hear. Let's see it then. Naruto stepped forward, and Sakura and Sasuke stayed back, watching him. He set himself in a concentrated stance, his feet widely planted and his posture completely upright, and held one hand out before him, the other settling into a claw over it. As Sakura watched intently, he started channeling chakra to his hand. A lot, enough for it to be visible, a faint blue glow growing in his hand. The glow grew, becoming a small sphere of violently rotating chakra. It wobbled, seemingly about to come apart, and Naruto's other hand came down, helping spin the chakra and directing it with small, quick motions, keeping its form. Just several seconds later, he drew his hand back with a prideful grin. There, sitting and keening in his hand, was a small ball of bright, dangerous chakra, spinning in place. Just looking at it, Sakura could tell that it was dangerous. She had no idea what would happen if it hit something, but that much chakra spinning so rapidly it almost looked like it wasn't moving would probably blow a hole through a stone wall with ease. Naruto held the jutsu in his hand for 10 seconds, luxuriating in the attention being paid to him, and then closed his fingers. The rays vanished, and the sound and light with it. The Hokage smiled. Nicely done. Across from him, the third Hokage grinned. Very good, Naruto, the older man said, and Sakura's teammate beamed. The third had a comforting voice. He'd occasionally spoken at the academy, and Sakura had always been compelled to listen. In a way, he was a grandfather to the entire village. To acquire an A-rank jutsu at your age is no easy task. He glanced at both Sasuke and Sakura. I hope you intend to share it. He better, Kushina huffed, before she smiled. Good job. Now get out of here, before I throw you out. Got it. Naruto gave her a thumbs up and beat a hasty retreat, and Sakura and Sasuke followed, not saying a word. They passed Hawk in the corridor, and the ninja inclined his head. Naruto held his hand out for a high five, and the Umbu stared at him, leaving him hanging. Sakura's teammate just laughed. Yeah, that's fair, he said, and they made their way down the corridor, away from the office. That's an interesting technique, Sasuke said when they were nearly to the staircase. Sakura realized his Sharingan was winding away. It's nothing but chakra control, huh? Pretty much, Naruto said. That's what all the lessons were about, putting out enough to pop the ball, but then controlling it enough that it wouldn't damage anything. He scratched his cheek, and Sakura's eyes were drawn to the whisker-like scars there. So far as she could tell, her teammate had been born with them. She'd never asked where they'd come from. I guess if I put out too much but didn't control it, it would tear up my hand or something. That'd be nasty. It's pretty amazing, Naruto, Sakura agreed. She frowned. I wondered what they were talking about. What do ya mean? Naruto asked, and Sasuke nodded slowly. You didn't hear? He asked, and Naruto made a helpless gesture that made Sakura laugh. Your father said something about Sensei's old students. Do you have any idea what that meant? Nah, Naruto said, putting his hands behind his head in a gesture of an extravagant lack of care. No clue. I'll ask him about it if you want me to. Could you? Sakura asked, and Naruto glanced at her with a curious expression. I didn't know the fourth had any teammates. It would be interesting to learn about them. Naruto made a surprised face, and Sakura realized he hadn't been looking at it that way. Yeah, he said. That could be interesting. I'll see about that when he's not in a meeting. He grinned. And grumpy. He turned, taking the first step down the staircase. So, do you guys want ice cream or something? I could use a snack. That, Sakura thought, sounded pretty nice. She and Sasuke followed him out into the cool winter air, and by the time they reached the end of the street, immersed in conversation and speculation about the Raiznan, Sakura had forgotten all about her question. Obito Sensei Chapter 11. The Chunin Exam. Obito leaned back in his chair, watching his teammate closely. Rin quirked her head, a faint smile on her lips. He'd always liked that expression, but right now he couldn't enjoy it like normal, something in his gut was churning. The Chunin exam, huh? He said, and Rin rolled her eyes. It's every 6 months, she said. Well, usually. You can't really be surprised. Obito leaned forward, picking up his water. Rin had barged into his apartment and helped herself to his fridge, and now they were seated in his living room. When was the last time they'd been here together, he wondered. Months ago, maybe a year. Why was that? I'm not surprised it's here, Obito clarified. I'm surprised you think my team's ready. They've already been on an S-ish ranked mission, Rin said with a laugh. I've been watching you guys, you know. Obito almost choked on his water. Rin had been watching them. What exactly did she mean by that? Naruto's already figured out the Rasengan, and Sasuke's well on his way, in addition to all his other Uchiha stuff. And Sakura's been working so hard on her Kenjutsu, she's smart, and putting in her all. She took a sip of her beer. If they won't be ready now, when will they be? She tapped her forehead. Sensei's always saying the only thing you're missing is confidence, Obito, and he's right. When you were a kid. I was a kid. Obito was quiet, a little solemn. I didn't understand what the world was like. They both fell into a short silence. Invisible, choking dust filled the room, a long-gone gasp for air, a dull thud. It's going to be the safest exam in years, Rin said eventually. Maybe ever. Sensei doesn't want anything going wrong at this one. She leaned back, looking out the window. Cloud's still working on their weird chakra weapons, so they're not invited. I think they're the only one that's not, actually. That's how it is. It's all part of the game. She glanced back at Obito. They're not going to be in real danger. I know. Obito frowned. I get it. I know, Rin said. It's your decision to enter them in the end. I don't want to push you into it. But it'd be good for them. She set her beer down, and stood up. And for you? Where you headed? Obito asked, and Rin smiled. Back to the hospital, she said. Even if this is gonna be safe, it's still an exam, you know? Surprising things happen all the time. She winked. See you around. She walked out the front door as if it were hers and not his, and Obito watched her go. He looked back to the beer she'd left. He groaned, and leaned forward to toss the can in the trash. What's the worst that could happen? ###. The Chunin exam. Sakura looked over, carefully sheathing her sword at her hip. Both the blade and the sheath had been a gift from Tenten, though Sakura had bought them with her own money. Her training partner had helped her pick out something that fit her and was comfortable to wear. It made her feel more real, like a proper ninja, to carry around a sword at her hip. She wasn't sure if that was immature or not, but Sakura enjoyed the feeling anyway. Sasuke had asked the question, looking at a piece of paper that Obito had offered him. Naruto was beside him, scratching his head and picking burned hairs off of it. The both of them had been sparring as Sakura slid through her kata, flowing from one sword strike to another, and Sasuke had ended up catching some of Naruto's blonde hair on fire with a small jutsu. Do you think we're ready, Obito, Sensei? Naruto asked, and Obito smirked at the quick correction. I'm not sure, he said, and Sakura walked over to join them, staring at the paper curiously. It was a sign-up form, she realized, for the next Chunin exam. Were they that close already? She knew they were a regular thing, but for some reason hadn't even thought they were coming up so soon. The paper said January 1st, only a week and some away. But like with a lot of things about being a shinobi, there's only one way to find out. He looked around at them, his gaze lingering on Sakura. To her surprise, she didn't flinch back. After 6 months on the team, she could meet Obito's gaze without fear. You're stronger. You're figuring out what being a ninja means. How much of that voice was really her, she wondered. It always felt too ambitious, a little too resentful. She wasn't like that, was she? Sakura wasn't ambitious and didn't resent people. At least, she didn't think so. But Sakura couldn't deny herself, she was stronger. The fact she could look her sensei in the eyes without feeling like she didn't belong was proof of that. You guys will be the ones entering, their sensei continued. The decision's yours, even if I'm the one who turns the paper in. He crossed his arms. So, what do you think? Sakura was sure that both her teammates would jump on the opportunity immediately and drag her into it. That was usually how it went, in her experience. But to her surprise, Naruto frowned and sat down, some of his hair still sizzling. I dunno, he said after a moment, and Sakura stared at him. Naruto, what do you mean? She asked, and her teammate looked up at her in confusion. I thought, you don't want to be a Chunin. Naruto was the ambitious one, Naruto was the one who had figured out the Rasengan in just a couple months. I do. Naruto said. I definitely do. But. Oh, Sasuke said quietly. You idiot. You don't wanna try unless you're gonna pass. Hey. Naruto shot to his feet. There's nothing stupid about that. Is that true, Naruto? Obito asked, and Naruto shifted. Sorta. Sasuke's a dumbass, so he's not saying it right. Sasuke smirked, and Naruto sneered at him, Sakura watching the back and forth with amusement. It's like, the Chunin exam is a pretty big deal. I don't wanna be one of those guys who takes it like 10 times, you know. He looked around at his teammates. If we're gonna do it, I wanna do it right, the first time. It's a good idea, Sasuke said with a small frown. Even if we don't pass, it's one of the best opportunities to meet ninja from other villages. He looked to their sensei. And you know that, right? That's why you brought this to us at all. It's our best chance to get stronger, and learn more. Sasuke sighed. But I get it. Honestly, I don't wanna fail either. Obito frowned. You can't let that hold you back. You'll fail sometimes, all of you, he said, and Sakura thought he sounded a little sad about that truth. That's life. If you avoid failure, you'll never improve. They pondered that for a second, and then Sakura stepped forward. Sensei. She wasn't really sure what she was going to say. I think. What did she think? They were looking at her now. What if she didn't have anything to say? I think that first C rank taught us all something, she finally decided, and both her teammates watched her with careful eyes. She was just stating the obvious, and they were wondering why. I think, all of us, we didn't really know that being a ninja would be like that. Blood in her hair. It was hot. Sakura shoved the memory back down where it had come from. The world's big, she said. And if you mess up, you'll die. She took a deep breath. But the Chunin exam's not like that, right? It's in the village. You're mostly right, Obito nodded. This one is taking place here, in Konoha, and most of the villages there are minor or allies. Sand, grass, river, tea, rain dash. Rain. Naruto quirked an eyebrow. I thought. I didn't think rain was either of those. His eyes went wide. Oh, shit. He spun around. Sakura, I forgot. Obito cuffed him on the back of the head for his profanity, and Naruto shot him a glare before looking back at her. I forgot about your question. My question? Sakura asked, and Naruto spread his arms wide. Yeah. About my dad's teammates. Sakura blinked. Right. That had been weeks ago, the short snippet of conversation she'd heard in the Hokage's office. She'd completely forgotten about it afterwards, it had only been a passing interest. Your dad's teammates? Obito asked with a questioning look. None of them are around anymore. He frowned. They're all not. Naruto waved him off. Not his original team. I asked him about it, he wasn't talking about them, he was talking about some of his master's other students. Obito's eyes went a little wide. Oh, them. Them. Sasuke and Sakura asked at the same time, and they looked at each other with amusement. Sasuke made a deferential gesture, and Sakura giggled. Them. She asked again, alone this time. Them, Obito confirmed dramatically, and Sasuke rolled his eyes. Sensei was trained by the Toad Sage, Jiraiya. I trained with him as well, for a little while. Jiraiya Sensei had other students as well, a couple over the course of his life. He crossed his arms and sat down, and his students followed him. Their sensei was being really serious, Sakura thought. The feeling was in the air, like an invisible weight, he was telling them something important. There were 3 in particular, that he picked up in the Land of Rain during the Second War. That was where the Sunin got their name, you know, they fought the leader of Omegakur, Hanzo the Salamander, and they walked away, he said, and Naruto cocked his head. They didn't win? He asked, and Obito laughed. Hanzo was an incredible shinobi, he explained. They were all leaning in now. This wasn't as scary as it should have been, Sakura thought. They'd already seen what the world had to offer. Right now, she was just consumed by curiosity. Flee on sight, just like your dad. He could poison whole battlefields in an instant, and controlled exploding tags like they were alive. The way people told me when I was a kid, you didn't fight Hanzo, you started suffocating and then suddenly exploded. He shrugged. But the Sunin managed to stalemate him, and so he declared that they were worthy of being recognized and spread their name to all of the countries across the world. I guess he was kinda a megalomaniac, when I put it that way. Sasuke chuckled. It sounds that way, he said. Maybe he wanted them to be famous so it wouldn't be bad for his reputation, not being able to kill them. Maybe. Obito laughed. Maybe. But I got sidetracked. The point is, Jiraiya Sensei picked up 3 orphans in AIM, and stayed behind to train them when the war was winding down. He was famous enough at that point to do that, so long as he stayed loyal, the village didn't care what he did with his time in a neutral country. Their sensei frowned. He told me once he thought they had potential, never figured out what he meant by that. But he was definitely right in a way, because those 3 kids grew up into pretty spectacular shinobi. They must have been. Naruto cut in. They took over the country. Hey. Obito said, and Naruto smirked at him. I thought I was telling the story. You're going too slow. Naruto declared, and Obito fumed. I'm building it up. He said, and Sakura couldn't help but laugh. You've got no appreciation for that, Naruto. You can't just jump straight to the end. Well, that's the important part, right? Naruto asked. Those 3, Konan, Yahiko, and, Nagato, Obito grunted, and Naruto nodded his head sagely. Konan, Yahiko, and Nagato. Do you know how they overthrew the country? The blonde shrugged, and Obito shook his head in despair. Sakura, however, was wondering about something else. Naruto, you meant the village, right? She asked, and her teammate gave her a confused look. Not the country. No, he's right, their sensei said. Though probably by accident. Naruto huffed, and Sakura leaned back, putting both her hands on the ground. They took over the entire country? All of the Land of Rain? She asked, and Obito nodded. What happened to the government? The daimyo. Imprisoned, Obito said, and both Sakura and her teammates had to take a moment to consider that. You couldn't just imprison the daimyo. The villages worked together with their country's governments, they didn't have the manpower or means to actually govern the countries themselves, and no desire to take up that burden. Doing otherwise was. So that's the trouble they're making then, Sakura said, and Obito shrugged. That was a long time ago, he said. The village hidden in the rain became the nation of rain over 10 years ago, though everyone still just treats them like a village. It's an unusual situation, after all. Wow, Sakura said, not really sure what else to say. Naruto frowned. I wasn't asking the right questions, he muttered to himself. Is that why I've never met Dad's master? He asked. Cause of this. Perceptive, Obito said, tapping his temple. Yeah. Jiraiya Sensei isn't exactly an outcast, but because of those orphans he decided to train, another village is rising. Rain has even started calling their leader, Yahiko, the Omekage. He rested his head in one hand. Sakura had never heard this before. To her knowledge, Only the 5 largest villages had leaders who declared themselves Kage. Minor ones like Grass, or what Rain was supposed to be, wouldn't claim that title, it would be way too presumptuous. He couldn't have known, but people still blame him. That's just how it is, I guess. That's not fair, Sasuke said with a frown, and Obito pinned him with a glance. Things often aren't, he said, and Sakura could only watch helplessly as something passed unspoken between them. So, that's the answer to your question, Sakura, their sensei continued. You were saying something else, before Naruto interrupted, weren't you? Naruto protested, and Sakura tried to remember where she'd been. I think we should sign up, she said after a moment. That's where I was going with that. If we pass, that'll be amazing, and if we fail, we'll know how not to next time. She looked at both her teammates. It can't be any worse than our C rank, right? I understand not wanting to do it more than once, but there's no real harm. I think we should go for it. She'd always been prepared to fail, Sakura thought. In that respect, the exam held no fear for her. Naruto gave her a doubting look, but Sasuke spoke before he could. She's right, he said, looking at Obito. Where do I sign? Naruto looked back and forth between the two of them, and sighed. All right, he said good-naturedly. But if we're gonna do this, we're gonna win, right? Without a doubt, Sasuke said, his conviction almost tangible, and Sakura found herself agreeing with him, to her surprise. I think we can, she said. It's not 100%, but I think we're ready, Naruto. We can do it. Together, Obito said. He passed the paper to Sasuke and pointed out a signature line, and pulled a pen from one of his pockets. He kept speaking as Sasuke scribbled down his consent. If I know Sensei at all, the exam will be a test of teamwork more than anything else. If you guys can't work together, there's no way we'll pass. Well, that shouldn't be a problem then. Naruto grinned. We just stick together, we pass, we become Chunin, then, He scratched his head. What do we do when we're Chunin, Obito Sensei? Well, you'll still be my team, Obito said. You've gotta be under supervision at least a year, usually, before you can start taking missions on your own. That's barring circumstances, obviously. But you'll get some prestige, and make a little more money. Cool, Naruto said. That sounds cool. I'm in. They all signed the form. Sakura tried not to read the bits about not being held liable for dismemberment or death too closely. When they were done, Obito packed it into his back pocket and stood back up. I'll turn this in, he said. As for you guys, if you're serious about passing, we should get training. The Chunin exam attracts the best of the best, genin-wise. It's a chance for all their villages to strut their stuff. He winked. So show off, would you? ####. 2 days before the exam, foreign shinobi started entering the village. Sakura and her teammates had been training together with Might Guy's team. Tenten and her teammates were determined to take the exam as well, and Guy was equally determined to punch Obito in the face at least once. Though it hadn't been why she was there, Sakura had been having enormous fun sparring with Tenten and then taking breaks to watch Obito dance around Guy. Sasuke and Neji had competed as well, but Neji had trounced Sasuke without much effort, leaving him on the ground with a bruised solar plexus. Sakura had expected that to discourage Sasuke, but it had been just the opposite. Since Neji had beaten him, he'd relentlessly challenged the older boy, apparently desperate to defeat it. The gentle fist, the Hyuga martial art, was beautiful to watch, Sakura thought. Even if Neji was using it to relentlessly beat one of her teammates up, the flowing motions and complete lack of wasted movements that the martial art incorporated were amazing. She wondered if it would have any use for her sword. At one point Naruto had stepped in as well, and Neji had been happy to fight him and Sasuke at the same time. The result had been the same, the both of them on the ground, groaning and gasping for air. Sakura had never realized how glad she would be for Neji not to have any interest in defeating her, before that. Tenten had laughed when she'd told her. He's like that, she'd said, as if it were inescapable as gravity. Sakura's hair was pink, the sun rose and set, and Neji beat anyone who challenged him into a semi-liquid paste, regardless of who they were. They were heading back to the center of the village, all 8 of them, when they met their first foreign ninja. He wasn't much to look at. The foreigner was a tall boy with pale hair and purple eyes. They nearly bumped into each other at a busy intersection filled with people heading every which way, and he looked down at Sakura, and then at all of the other ninja with her, taking in their hitai. Sakura couldn't help but notice his own. It was attached to his hip, apparently woven into his long black pants, and it had 3 straight lines drawn vertically down it. She didn't recognize the symbol. "Hey," the shinobi said. Sakura's teammates crossed their arms. Both of the adults gave the boy a blank look. "I'm kinda lost. You know where I can get a drink around here?" Obito raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "A shinobi should be able to locate food on their own," he said dryly, and the boy grinned. His teeth were sharp and triangular, like a shark. Sakura had never seen teeth like that before in her life. She wondered if the boy had ever accidentally bitten his lip, or tongue. "Rude," he said. "I didn't realize Konoha's shinobi were so inhospitable to guests." He fished beneath his shirt and withdrew a lanyard with a card on it. A visitation pass, Sakura saw after he stopped waving it around. It was a simple thing, something you could get at the gate if you were entering the village with a stranger. She'd only seen it once before. If this ninja was here for the Chunin exams, which he almost certainly was, it made perfect sense for him to have one. "Ah." Lee stepped forward, all smiles. "You must be here to compete." He gestured around. "There are many spectacular restaurants and shops in the village, perhaps one of them holds what you seek." The boy looked Lee up and down with an obvious expression of disbelief. "Geez," he muttered. "Never mind. I'm just gonna find something myself." "Don't make any trouble," Niji said placidly as the shinobi stepped past them, and the boy sneered. "We'll be watching." "Sure you will," the foreigner jeered. "Don't worry. I'm saving all my trouble for the exam." Then he strode down the street, and was gone in the press of people before Sakura knew it. "What a blowhard," Suzuki muttered. "He was from the Nation of Rain," Guy said, watching the shinobi go with keen eyes. "I doubt he's truly lost." He glanced at Obito. "Do you reckon they are all such troublemakers?" "He wasn't making any trouble," Obito said with a shrug. "Just wandering. I'm sure it's fine." He tilted his head up slightly. "And anyway, it looks like he's being watched." He was right, Sakura realized. She only caught a flicker of movement from one rooftop to another, over a nearby alleyway, but it was enough to tell her that a shinobi had just repositioned, moving after the boy with shark teeth. Her sensei wasn't worried, and so she wasn't either, but it did make her curious. What about that ninja merited being monitored? Was the village keeping tabs on every foreigner who entered? Well, it wasn't any of her business, in the end. "Come in," Obito said. He had one idea right. "We should get something to eat." Team 7 said their goodbyes to Guy and his team and made their way down the street, into the depths of the village, and were soon lost in the mazes of buildings and masses of people. ####. The day of the exam, Sakura arrived at the academy, where the first stage was being held. When she arrived, she wasn't surprised to find Suzuki and Obito there as well. Naruto was late, as usual. "Morning." She was a little subdued in her greeting, and they gave her a nod in return. There were butterflies in her stomach. Signing up for the exam had been one thing, it actually being here was another. Had she been thinking straight? They'd only been genin for 6 months, all of the other competitors would have at least a year on them, surely. "Actually, Sensei," she asked as they waited in silence outside the gates of the academy. "Did any other teams beside Tentans enter the exam? I never asked before." A couple," he said, scratching his chin. "I know that other than Guy, both Asuma and Kurane have put their teams in the mix." He noticed her look of confusion. "That's 8 and 10. 8, Hinata, Shino, and Kiba, and 10, Shikamaru, Ino, and Koji." Sakura felt herself relax a little. They weren't going in alone. They wouldn't be the only new graduates there. At least they wouldn't look like overconfident idiots, or at least look like that alone. "Hey!" Naruto ran up out of breath, and completely severed Sakura's train of thought. Sorry. My dad made a big breakfast. The Hokage? Sakura asked, and Naruto nodded. He's a really good cook, he said with a grin. Mom. He wobbled his hand. Not so much. Did I miss anything? Not really, Naruto, their sensei said. We were just standing here, staring at the door, waiting for you. That was nice of you, Naruto said, either not detecting or not willing to acknowledge Obito's tone. We heading in then? Soon as I give you a little advice, Obito said, turning to regard them all. Stick together. Don't treat this like the end of the world. It's just a test. Do your best, and we'll all be proud of you. Thank you for the wisdom, Sasuke said rather dryly, and Sakura giggled. Her fingers were drumming on the hilt of her sword, she realized. She was definitely nervous, but she couldn't deny there was an eagerness there as well. She wanted to get started. Anything solid? Nah. Obito shrugged. You'll be fine. Good luck. Without preamble or another parting word, he vanished in a swirl of space and time, and left Team 7 alone in front of the academy. Well, Sakura said. Should we head in? Let's, Sasuke confirmed, and he took the lead, striding ahead towards the front door. He opened it without fear, and his teammates followed him. They were supposed to meet in room 302, the largest room in the building, and they took the familiar stairs as if it were any other days. There was a large congregation of shinobi on the second floor, arguing with two Chunin. Sakura gave them a confused look as she passed them heading farther up the building, wondering what they were wasting time for. She wondered if it was a trick, had they been given the wrong room? But when they reached the third floor and Sasuke stepped into 302, she became sure that wasn't the case. The room was full of shinobi, well over 100, by Sakura's guess. 302 was the size of an auditorium and it had a high ceiling, so it didn't quite feel cramped, but it was definitely approaching it. Looking around, Sakura saw Hitayate from a dozen different villages, as well as quite a few Konoha headbands. She caught a glimpse of Tenten and her team across the room, and waved. Tenten gave a distracted wave back, engrossed in conversation with Niji. Ah! The quiet exclamation came from to her left, and Sakura turned towards it. Sasuke? And Naruto and Sakura? You're here too. Hinata Hyuga, looking small but not afraid, stepped past a press of shinobi debating the finer points of knife work with a smile. I'm glad. Of course they're here. Kiba was right behind her, shoving his way through the group Hinata had skirted and baring his fangs at one who tried to shove him back. They'd look like a bunch of idiots if they weren't, wouldn't they? That's not very nice, Kiba, Hinata frowned, and Sakura smiled. It's good to see you, Hinata, she said, and the Hyuga smiled back. Her pale, empty eyes had scared Sakura a little when they'd first met, but after years of being classmates now she barely noticed them. We heard Team 10 was here too, have you seen them? They haven't arrived yet, Hinata said, fidgeting a little. Kiba laughed. Shikamaru must be holding them up. Or Koji. He nodded, 100% sure of his assessment. They never were the fastest. What about Shino? Naruto asked with a confused look. Isn't he here with you? I am. Naruto jumped, looking behind him. Shino had approached without a sound, none of them had noticed him approaching. This promises to be an interesting exam. Why? He gestured around. Look at the number of villages, this must be unusual. He was right, Sakura thought. There really were a lot of different villages here. Minor ones of every kind, including several she didn't recognize. She even caught a glimpse of a stone Hitayate, which surprised her. There were several different teams from Sunagakure as well, clustered in the corner. They seemed to be keeping to themselves, more than anyone else. One of them, Sakura realized with a jolt, was staring at them as they chatted by the door. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor in the middle of the group, a large gourd strapped to his back. The boy looked strange, like Hinata. He didn't have pupils, but his eyes weren't the milky white of the Byakugan. They were green, closer to teal, and their striking color was only accentuated by the thick bags beneath the shinobi's eyes and his lack of eyebrows. He had a red tattoo on his forehead as well, which only threw them further into contrast. He looked incredibly tired, Sakura thought, but he was still totally alert. His eyes shifted, locking with her own, and Sakura realized he'd been looking to her right, to Naruto and Sasuke. They stared at each other for a moment, and Sakura felt rooted in place. She didn't know what was causing it, but the sensation of frozen time was eerily familiar. It was just like it had been in the temple, she thought. That was it. When Haydn had leapt up on the wall and stared at them, ready to attack at the first sign of movement. That was what was happening. Sakura felt herself break into a cold sweat, her hand tightened around her sword. 3, 4, 5 seconds. Eventually, very deliberately, Sakura slowly dragged her gaze away, staring at the floor, and she felt the pressure fade. Sakura. Hinata was the one who noticed. Naruto and Sasuke were busy arguing with Kiba about who would finish the exam first, and Shino was watching the whole thing with his usual unreadable expression. "What's wrong?" "That boy," she said quietly, and both teams hushed up at her tone. "He's staring at us." "Hey!" Naruto demanded. "Who's staring at us?" He looked around. "That sand creep." He made a shooing motion, and to Sakura's horror, the boy with green eyes smiled. It wasn't an expression with any joy, he just showed his teeth, his cheeks wrinkling. "Geez," Sasuke said as the boy turned away and murmured something to a tall blonde girl besides him. "What a freak." "He's not the only one," Hinata said timidly. "Watching, I mean. A couple teams have been watching you three since you arrived." "Who?" Sasuke asked, and Hinata blushed, pointing discreetly around the room. "That team, from Stone." She was right, 2 girls and 1 boy, all with pitch black hair, all staring intently at Naruto. He stuck his tongue out at them and they turned away, whispering amongst themselves. "And that team, from Omegakure?" Hinata tilted her head, and Sakura followed the vector. To her surprise, she found she recognized one of the shinobi discreetly eyeing them. "It's that boy," she said, and Sasuke nodded his head in agreement. "From the market." The boy with shark teeth nodded at her, recognizing that she'd noticed his observation, and Sakura decided the only thing she could really do was nod back. Like everyone else in the room, he had 2 teammates with him. They were both seated at one of the many desks scattered throughout the room. One of them, an older boy with gray hair and large, round glasses, was peaceably chatting with a team from the land of rivers, gesturing widely and smiling guileless. He had a very friendly smile, Sakura thought, but it was impossible to know if it was genuine. The other was a girl with sharp, beautiful features and warm brown eyes. Unlike her teammates, who had minimalistic brown clothes that didn't express much identity but were certainly warm and convenient, she wore a short haori over a pure white shirt and a long black skirt. Sakura had to admit the haori had an interesting and eye-catching design. It was dark black, but there were a series of asymmetrical red clouds woven into the material, covering the back and sleeves. Like the boy from Sand, the girl from Rain caught Sakura's eye, but this time she didn't feel the need to run away. Instead, she smiled, and Sakura smiled back uncertainly. "Wonder why they're watching us," Naruto said, his hands behind his head. Behind him, Team 10 slipped into the room, squabbling amongst themselves. Sakura waved at Ino, and the blonde girl gave her a dismissive one in turn as she continued to badger Shikamaru relentlessly. Duh, Kiba smirked. He pointed at Naruto. "Hokage's son." Then to Sasuke. "Fancy Uchiha." Then last, to Sakura. "Pink hair," he finished, and Sakura resisted the urge to both roll her eyes and shrivel up a little. "Was that all?" "Eyes front." Sakura turned in surprise at the words, just in time to watch over a dozen ninja materialize in a cloud of smoke at the front of the room. A moment later, she realized that she hadn't heard anything. The voice had rung through her head, but there hadn't been a sound accompanying it. In fact, she hadn't been the only one to turn, the whole room had at the same time, at the same not sound. The ninja were diverse, one of them was an Uchiha, 2 of them were Hyuga, and all of the others were distinct, but the shinobi in front drew the most attention. He was a tall man with a strong, broad face, and had a golden ponytail that went down past his waist. He wore a flak jacket, and a red vest over it. Ah, crap, Ino muttered, coming up next to her. Sakura glanced back and forth between her classmate and the man at the front, and realized they had the same hair and similar eyes. They were definitely related. "Good morning," the Yamanaka said, his voice deep and steady. It was the same voice Sakura and the rest of the room had heard in their head. "Since you all seem to be getting along so well, the exam will now commence." He looked around the room, taking them all in instantly. "As I'm sure you're aware, there will be no fighting without permission from the proctors. You have already obeyed that admirably, I hope that will continue to be the case." He began pacing, hands clasped behind his back and ponytail slightly swaying with the motion. "This exam will be divided into 3 distinct tests," he said, enunciating every word. His voice carried to the back of the room without effort. "I am Inoichi Yamanaka, and this first test will be under my purview." He came to a stop. There are, throughout this and the neighboring building, 34 specially prepared rooms. It is not a coincidence that this is the same number of teams that are present here today. They would each get their own room for the test? Sakura looked around, taking in the other ninjas' reactions. Many were doing the same thing she was, some were telling jokes, and a few just stared ahead with a razor focus. "Each of you will be sealed in one of those rooms," Inoichi said, and a murmur passed around the crowd. "You will be presented with an objective, accomplish it and depart the room, and you will pass the test." His eyes narrowed. "If you leave the room without accomplishing the objective, you will have abandoned the mission, you will be disqualified. If you fail to accomplish the objective, you will be disqualified." His eyes closed completely. "Do not think you'll be able to deceive me if you cannot accomplish the objective, because I will. No." Sakura heard the voice again, and she was sure that everyone else did too. The man was speaking directly to their minds. Was it a bluff, or could he really read them that easily? She decided she didn't want to find out. "Easy," Suzuki muttered, and Sakura looked over to find him practically trembling with anticipation. He was excited, much more excited than her. The same, she saw, was true for Naruto. Her team was raring to go. "Now, you all understand what is required of you," Inoichi said, raising his hand. He snapped his fingers, and the shinobi behind him fanned out, a couple creating clones. The space descended into organized chaos as the various teams were gathered up and herded out of various doors, towards their assigned rooms. Thus, the first test shall begin. Obito Sensei Chapter 12. The first test. 30 minutes. The door closed behind them, and then, to Sakura's astonishment, it vanished. What kind of trick was that? Suzuki experimentally kicked at the spot where the door had once been, and Naruto flinched. "Hey!" he shouted, and his friend looked over his shoulder at him. "Careful! What if it was just an illusion? We'll get disqualified for busting out." "It's not an illusion." Suzuki's eyes were red. "It really did disappear." "Huh." Naruto wandered up as well, and gave the wall a kick of his own. Sakura watched both her teammates, resisting the urge to laugh. "That's crazy. I wonder how Later, Suzuki said, moving back towards the center of the room. "Doesn't matter now. Sakura, what do we have?" The room was small and drab, less than 15 feet from wall to wall. The only piece of furniture was a desk in the center, upon which was a single piece of paper. There were no windows, the walls were covered in paper as well, embossed with kanji. They swirled across the entire room like a madman's scrawling, some even making their way onto the ceiling. Looking around at the sheer number of symbols, Sakura felt totally overwhelmed. On the wall opposite where the door had been, there was a small electronic keypad. Unlike everything else, it was simple, just 10 digits, not even an enter key. "I don't know," she admitted to Suzuki. 30 minutes, I guess." He gave her a light-hearted smirk and Sakura smiled back, a little proud of making her teammate laugh, even if it wasn't out loud. She picked up the paper on the desk, looking over it with a critical eye. At first glance, it was just more nonsense, a series of tightening concentric rings composed of both kanji and simple symbols. The spiral made Sakura a little dizzy, and she rotated the paper, following the chain of kanji. At the center, there was something coherent, written out in circular katakana, access code. Naruto looked as dizzy as Sakura felt, twisting his head to try and follow the kanji. I don't get it. It's a cipher. Sakura ventured, and was relieved when Sasuke nodded in agreement. He frowned, his Sharingan slowly rotating as he regarded both the paper and the walls around them. It's a cipher, Sasuke confirmed. But the actual code? He spun, regarding the whole room. All I can see initially is that it corresponds to the cardinal directions. Sakura blinked, looking at the paper and then at the room's four walls. He was right, specific combinations of numbers appeared on the north, south, east, and west walls, and they matched patterns on the four corners of the paper. But, where did it lead from there? What was the relationship of the kanji to the points of the compass? They needed a code for the keypad. How long would it be? Naruto, she asked as she and Sasuke continued to intensely glare at the paper. Can you go press a number on the keypad? Which one? He asked, scratching the back of his head, and Sakura blew out a frustrated breath. Anyone, she said, and Naruto shrugged and wandered over to the keypad to do just that. He pressed one of the keys, and the top of the pad lit up with a dim, fluorescent 7. How many does it look like it would fit? She asked, and Naruto squinted at the small electronic number. 5, I think, he said after a moment, and Sasuke looked over as well. The 7 faded a couple seconds later, leaving the pad blank once more. 5, he agreed, and Sakura bit her lip. 4 directions, each with a dedicated combination of kanji, but 5 numbers for the code in total. The mission was obvious. They needed to decipher the ridiculous access code and use it to get them out of the room. And now they only had about 28 minutes to do it. Okay, she sighed. Let's figure this out. Hashtag. Obito Uchiha sat down on the wooden bench and groaned, leaning back with his hands coming up behind his head and his legs stretching out before him. He rotated his neck, trying to work a kink out. He'd been way too tense all morning. Safest exam in years, Rin had said. He believed her, but seeing how many ninja had shown up had sparked a bit of sharp concern in the back of his head. It was an unusually large exam this year, with some exceptional entrants. No matter how well proctored it was, there was plenty of room for things to go wrong. Hey, Obito. Obito looked left. Asuma Sarutobi, as ever, had a cigarette dangling from his mouth. Beside him, Kurenai Yui gave a non-committal wave, and Obito lazily waved back at the both of them. The halls of the academy were bustling, but everyone who passed stepped around the two of them without complaint. Asuma. His fellow teacher sat down at his side, and Kurenai at the other side of him. Obito continued to try and work out his neck. You're sticking around too. It's only going to be another 10 minutes or so, Asuma said, scratching at his stubble. Be stupid not to, I'd say. Heh. Obito leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and stretching out his back. I guess so. You all right there? Kurenai asked with an amused lilt, and Obito snorted. Just a little tense, he said, and Kurenai let out a short laugh. She was always composed, and her laugh reflected that, Obito thought. She never let it get away from her. He could see the appeal. It wasn't any wonder she and Asuma had been going steady for over a year now. No need to be, she said, crossing her arms and legs and watching two bickering Chunin pass. Surely, your team will be fine. Yeah, they'll be fine. Obito straightened up. It's the others I'm worried about. Oh. Asuma looked over with a cocked eye, and Obito blinked. Shit, that came out wrong, he muttered. I didn't mean dash. Asuma laughed. I know what you mean, he said, taking a drag from his cigarette and holding it down between his legs and 2 fingers. The smoke from it wandered up, caressing his face. I've been thinking the same thing. And me, Kurenai added in. It's an interesting exam this year. How have your teams been doing? Obito asked. I've been self-absorbed as ever. I haven't really been keeping up. Another one of his bad habits. Good, Asuma said, twirling the cigarette around his fingers and leaving a complex smoke figure in its wake. Obito snorted, that was a neat trick. He must have been shaping it with his chakra. He was almost tempted to take a glance with his Sharingan. It's the Inoshikacho, but the kids have been putting their own spin on it. He took another drag. Ino's really matured in the last couple months, and Shikamaru's always been smart enough to keep out of trouble. Koji's the only one I'm not sure about right now, but I'm sure they'll get him through any problems. That's why I entered them. It'll be a good learning experience. It's the same with every team, I think, Kurane said. I feel the same way about Hinata. She's not quite there yet, but this might be all it takes. Obito frowned. You're not expecting them to pass. Kurane shrugged. They might, she said, and Asuma nodded in agreement. It's possible. But I'm not putting any money on them making Chunin on their first try. This is a learning experience, first and foremost. Oh. Asuma elbowed him, and Obito shoved him back good-naturedly. Maybe you're feeling differently. Naruto and Sasuke don't want to take the exam more than once, Obito said with a grin, and both of his fellow teachers laughed. You know how they can get. They must have dragged Sakura into it then. Asuma grinned. Well, maybe dash. Actually. Obito leaned back, quirking his lips. It was the other way around. Oh. Kurane looked over Asuma's shoulder, her red eyes growing a little wider. That's unusual. I think Sakura is looking at it the same way you two are, Obito said, looking behind him, out one of the academy's windows. It was a sunny day, but it wasn't very warm. Depending on where it was held, that could make the second portion of the exam interesting. She's not hung up on winning, she just wants more experience. Asuma put out his cigarette, burning it to ash in his hands and wiping the soot on his pant leg. He was careful to avoid the white mark that always hung from his hip, emblazoned with the symbol of fire. Obito didn't know much about Asuma's time with Guardian Ninja, the dozen shinobi who were entrusted with the protection of the daimyo over their lives. He'd never taken much interest in politics, even with his sensei taking up the Hokage's position. She always seemed smart. She had the grades for it. Top kunoichi, right. Jounin picked for training duties were encouraged to keep a close eye on the graduating classes, and Asuma was the son of the Sandaime besides, he'd always taken an interest in the education of younger shinobi. Yes, Kurane confirmed. Lower taijutsu marks than Hinata, and lower teamwork marks than Ino, but she still beat out both of them everywhere else. For all the other girls in the class, it wasn't even a competition. She glanced at Obito. Still, on your team. It was hard for her, at first, Obito admitted. Naruto and Sasuke are. I should say, aren't subtle. Both his fellow teachers chuckled. Without a doubt. Still, if she's the one who pushed them into it, it seems like she's maturing faster. Asuma frowned. A little surprising, I guess. We'll see, Obito said. He wasn't sure himself. If they pass this first test, then the rest of the exam will probably show us for sure. Of course, Kurane said, and then paused. Depending on who they come up against. What do you mean? Obito asked. Asuma started to reach for another cigarette and Kurane grabbed his hand and set it back in his lap. The Sarutobi scowled at his girlfriend. Sand and rain, mostly, Kurane said. They both sent interesting teams this year. I'll say, Asuma said, his scowl fading. I'm surprised Sand sent their Jinhiriki. They must really be confident in the alliance, to show him off. That's probably all they're doing, Obito said idly. Showing him off. Gaara of the desert, right? I heard from Kushina that he's got an impressive record. Asuma nodded. He's already been sent on an A-rank mission, he said, and Obito made a surprised noise at the back of his throat. On purpose, I mean, Asuma said with a laugh. He's the Kazekige's son, the guy seems confident in him. He's even here in person to watch him compete. His laugh turned into a frown. But something's off about him. The kid, not the Kazekage. I'm not sure if you had a chance to see him. No, Obito said. I tried not to stalk any of the new arrivals. Didn't want to give the wrong impression. My team ran into him yesterday, Asuma said, his frown deepening. He's not normal. Beyond the obvious, I mean. He's got. Asuma paused, searching for the words. He's a killer, he eventually decided. I think he enjoys it. Shit. Asuma was a good judge of character, it was something he'd inherited from his father. If he could have told Obito that based on a single encounter with Sans Jinchuriki, then Obito had no doubt it was true. If that's the case, they'll notice, Kurane said, talking about their teams. And hopefully stay out the way. Yeah, Obito said, crushing the churning in his gut. His team had already seen someone who held killing close to his heart, they'd know the signs, and take care of themselves. He had to believe that. Honestly, I'm more worried about the team from Rain, Kurane continued. Sending a Jinchuriki is one thing. A member of the Akatsuki is another. Oh? Asuma asked, as Obito sat up in shock. Really? He asked, and Kurane nodded. Hinata spotted him 2 days ago, and asked me about the clouds, she said. The boy wears a haori with the design, but it's unmistakable. He's definitely a member, despite his youth. Well, doesn't mean anything on its own. Asuma muttered, cracking a knuckle. He was starting to fidget without a new cigarette to focus on. You don't get into the Akatsuki based on your strength, just your dedication to their mission. If you were that dedicated to their mission, why would you even participate in the exam at all? Obito asked, and Asuma shrugged. Rain is full of hypocrites, he said, and Kurane laughed. No point in worrying about it. I'm sure if they're actually Akatsuki, the village is already keeping an eye on them. The Yondaime wouldn't let one of them walk around without being watched. Obito remembered the boy from Rain his team and guys had met before, the one with shark teeth and strange, pale skin. He'd had an escort, Umbu watching from the rooftops, just as Asuma had supposed. The Sandaime's son was right, his sensei was aware that the team of an Akatsuki member couldn't go unsupervised. Yeah, he said slowly. Yeah. Nothing to worry about. Plenty to worry about, Asuma grunted, and Obito chuckled. But for us, not the kids. He glanced around, looking for a clock. How much longer? 5 minutes, Kurane said. Things will be wrapping up soon. Interesting test this year, Obito remarked. Having to escape a room. I remember ours tested information gathering, I guess this one is critical thinking. Asuma shrugged. It might be that straightforward. The proctors are all straightforward guys this year. He grinned. But it wouldn't be much of a shinobi exam if it weren't testing more than one thing, would it? ####. This is bullshit. Naruto declared, and Sakura found herself agreeing with him 100%. Her teammate was pacing, looking like he was ready to claw at the walls with his bare hands. Sasuke wasn't moving, just staring at the cipher with his Sherry non-active, stock still, but Sakura could tell he was just as frustrated as Naruto, maybe even more so. 3 minutes, Sasuke muttered, and Sakura found herself looking back to the paper one last time. They'd finished most of it by the 10-minute mark, plenty of time to spare, or so she'd thought. The first 4 digits had been 3347. But now, they didn't have a fifth. The cardinal points had been simple enough to decipher once she and Sasuke had figured out the pattern behind the kanji. They'd been puns, of all things. She'd figured that out before Sasuke had. Geography puns, mountain, river, forest, valley, with the final number determined by stroke order and number of the signature kanji. It was incredibly complicated, but not an unbeatable cipher like Sakura had been fearing, just a tough one delivered in the most confusing manner possible. Or maybe it was, because they didn't have a final piece. Naruto had already run through what they'd managed to understand in every possible missing fifth digit, and the keypad had rejected him with an angry red light each time. It didn't make any sense. They were missing something that restructured the cipher entirely, or somehow they'd just got it totally and completely wrong from the beginning. 2 minutes, Sasuke muttered. Sasuke, could you dash? Sakura started to bite out, and then held it back, startled at her own tone. Was she really that frustrated? She'd been ready to fail, right? Being ready isn't the same as liking it. 2 minutes. Naruto paced forward, glaring at the table. Damn it! Stupid puzzle! He struck out in frustration, kicking the table with most of his strength and sending the cipher paper flying. The table flew up in the air, flipping end over end, and Sasuke's eyes went wide. He darted forward and caught one of the table legs, holding it in the air, and Sakura saw what had caught his eye. There was something carved in the bottom of the table, deep in the wood. "Kman," she said, not sure if she was about to laugh or cry, and Sasuke grunted and set the table down upside down, its legs sticking up in the air like a wooden spider as he bent down and examined the symbol carved into the base. It was the symbol for fire, surrounded by a spiral. There were arrows at the exit of the spiral. Just like when she'd first entered the room, Sakura was momentarily overwhelmed by the symbol's complexity, but she saw Sasuke's Sharingan darting over it effortlessly, taking everything in. "No way," Naruto breathed out, staring at the kanji. He looked over at Sakura. "We're not that stupid, right? We just had to look underneath dash." "Inverted," Sasuke declared, standing back up straight. Sakura didn't know what he meant. "The spiral inverts the kanji. It comes out." His eyes went wide. "Backwards. We are that stupid. Quit calling us stupid," Naruto shouted, already sprinting for the pad. "Just tell me what to do." "Less than 80 seconds now." Sasuke called out the code as Sakura stared at the bottom of the table, wondering what would have happened if Naruto hadn't kicked it. They'd been so caught up in the symbols on the paper and the walls, searching for an answer similar to the rest, that they hadn't even bothered to look underneath what they were given. What kind of lesson was that? 47433. Naruto rattled off as he punched in the numbers. The pad blinked green, the sharp light on top of it pulsing. "Hell yeah!" Naruto declared. It took it. They waited 10 seconds. Nothing happened. 70 seconds remaining. Sakura said. "There's no door." She wasn't sure what she'd expected from cracking the code, but nothing hadn't been on the list. Naruto looked around. "Maybe we just gotta wait." "The proctor said if we didn't leave the room we'd fail," Sasuke said, closing his eyes. "Maybe they were lying." "No." Sakura shook her head. "It can't be that." The realization came to her in a flash, and she couldn't suppress her laughter. "We have to make our own door." 50 seconds left. Naruto pounded his knuckles together and approached the spot where the door had vanished 29 minutes before. "Leave it to me," he grinned. "You guys solved that crap, I can solve this." He spread his feet, putting one hand out before him and cradling it with the other. Sakura and Sasuke both backed up as the distinctive whine of the Rasengan started emanating from Naruto's hand. 30 seconds. Naruto put more chakra into the jutsu than he had the last time Sakura had seen it, and it swelled up to half the size of his head. He stepped back, bracing himself. "Rasengan," he declared, and drove the jutsu directly into the wall. The results were impressive. The wall twisted, the distortion passing so quickly that Sakura would have missed it if she blinked, and then exploded outward, the jutsu detonating in Naruto's palm and sending him stumbling back several steps. The force of the Rasengan tore a hole through the wall all the way up to and past the ceiling and 3 or 4 feet to either side of where Naruto had struck the building. They waited in stoic silence for a moment as some more rubble rained from the ceiling and Naruto shook out his hand, hissing. "Yosh," he muttered. "Didn't realize there'd be that much kick. That wall was hard as hell." Slowly, a Chunin with flat eyes and flatter hair poked his head around the corner, looking at the extent of the devastation Naruto had caused. He whistled, looked back to them, and then past them, to the blinking green light on the keypad. "A little overboard, don't you think?" he asked, and Sasuke smirked. "Only if we didn't pass," he said, and Naruto giggled. He seemed a little too excited at having gotten a chance to Rasengan something. Was that a verb, Sakura wondered? The Chunin scratched his chin, looking at a loss for words. Not sure if that was the intended solution, he admitted after a second, and Sakura blushed, feeling embarrassed for no reason. "But, you cracked the code, and you got out of the room. I guess you pass." He straightened up, giving them a sardonic bow. "And with 20 seconds to spare." Congratulations. Yeah, no problem, Naruto waved him off, and Sakura smiled. Definitely we're not panicking, she said, and the Chunin laughed. Well, just about everyone else is already on their way, he said. You guys better get going if you want to catch up. The second test will be starting in about 10 minutes. You're not gonna bring us there? Naruto asked, and the ninja snorted. You're a shinobi, and of the leaf, you can find your way, he said with a grin. Training ground 44. You better hurry. He turned around, walking down the hall and out of sight. Beat it. I'll pass on the good news. No need. Sakura heard the voice again, and she saw her teammates react as well. Well done, you three. Good thinking on your feet. Make your way to the training ground. Team 7 looked around, and then burst into motion. It would have been stupid to pass the first test by just a couple seconds and then be late for the second. They hurtled into the hallway, past the startled Chunin, and leapt out the nearest open window one after the other. Sakura had to be careful not to catch her sheath on the windowsill. It wasn't an extension of her body yet, but it was getting there. She was sure of it. Good luck. ####. They arrived at the outskirts of the 44th training ground with a couple minutes to spare, and came to a stop, panting. Even for a shinobi, running more than halfway across Konohagakure in a little over 5 minutes was a challenge. Okay, Naruto decided. This whole test is stupid, not just that puzzle. Quit whining, Sasuke said, blowing out a breath and steadying himself. He nodded his head at the mass of shinobi beyond the gate leading to the training zone. Looks like quite a few passed. He was right. The group was noticeably smaller than it had been starting out, but from a quick glance Sakura could tell there were still at least 20 teams in the mix. She and her teammates hopped the fence, clearing 15 feet with ease, and ambled into the midst of the group, looking for familiar faces. Tenten found her before Sakura did anyone else. Hey. The older girl said, wandering up and giving Sakura a slap on the shoulder. You passed. Nice. Barely, Sakura said. We had trouble with the test. Naruto looked like he wanted to say something, but after a second just frowned and nodded. Really? Tenten asked, looking askance at them. What did you guys have? We just had to eavesdrop on another room. Sasuke narrowed his eyes. What? Yeah, Tenten said, looking puzzled. There was a code we had to figure out, but it was way too complicated. There was no way we could have done it ourselves. Most of the answer was in the room next to ours though. Niji just looked through the wall and dash. Naruto slapped himself in the face, hard, and groaned. Sakura just closed her eyes, wanting to shrink down into the ground. At her side, she could practically hear Sasuke grinding his teeth. Wait. Tenten started giggling. Wait, did you guys just solve it? She started laughing. Geez, how smart are you? You actually solved that thing. Smart enough to solve the cipher, Sasuke said quietly. It was the first time Sakura had heard him express anything like embarrassment or self-deprecation. Not smart enough to know we didn't have to. Tenten just kept giggling, and her teammates wandered over, wondering what she was laughing about. Don't worry about it, she wheezed, waving off Lee's inquisitive look. God, that's too funny. She saw Sakura's face, and shook her head. Cheer up. You three must be geniuses, if you managed that. Don't feel like it, Sakura muttered, and Tenten descended back into laughter. Look at it this way, she said with a cough, finally getting full control of herself. There's 22 teams here now. That means more than a third dropped out on the first test. You did great. Guess they were the dumb without the dumb muscle, Naruto said, putting his hands behind his head, and Sakura finally found herself laughing as well. Well put, Niji said mildly. Of course, even more will fail this test. That's exactly right. The voice was huge and booming, and a mutter of surprise rapidly spread through the crowd of shinobi. Sakura turned around to find a giant striding towards her. She stumbled backwards in shock. The man was over 12 feet tall, with bright red hair that was longer than she was tall and a perpetual grin stuck to his face. He moved through the crowd and it parted before him like a wave, no one wanting to be stepped on. When he reached the front, he turned to them, putting his back to the forest, and scanned the astonished ninja, his enormous head slowly moving back and forth. "That's exactly right," he said once again. "Welcome. I am Choza Akimichi, the proctor for the second test. How is everyone doing today?" No one present said a thing. Either because they didn't want to answer, or because they were too surprised to. Sakura glanced over and found Team 10 watching the man intently. Choza looked just like Koji, the same way Inoichi had looked just like Ino. He might have been his father. She'd never had much interest in Koji, she certainly didn't know that he came from a clan of giants. "Fantastic," Choza said, taking the silence in stride. "So, 22 of you passed, did you? Well done, all of you." He reached behind him, into an enormous pouch resting on his lower back, his huge fingers moving dexterously. "Unfortunately, this next test will be more challenging." He removed something from the pouch, his huge hands hiding it completely. "This training ground is often referred to as the Forest of Death." He grinned. Shinobi love their jokes, as I'm sure you all know. The training ground is about 20 kilometers in diameter, and at the center of the forest, there is a tower, quite large and distinctive, you cannot miss it. "Like you," someone muttered, and a ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. Choza chuckled along with them. "Indeed," he said. "Now, to pass this test, you simply need to reach that tower. You will have 48 hours to do so, once the test begins." He looked around at all of them, his grin widening. "Of course, there is a condition." Naruto nudged Sakura, and she glanced at him. He jerked his head, and she followed the motion to find the girl from Rain, the one wearing a black haori with red clouds, watching them out of the corner of her eye. The girl saw Sakura's attention and shifted, whispering something to her teammate. The gray-haired boy laughed and nodded. Sakura really wished they wouldn't do that. It creeped her out. At least the boy with the gourd from sand wasn't watching them too, his team had passed, and they were near the front of the group silently and intently staring at Choza. The huge Akimichi brought his hand down and opened it up, revealing 10 scrolls in his palm. They were small and tan, and seemed even more so lying in such a large hand. Each was marked with a symbol on the side. "I have 10 scrolls here," Choza said, his voice rumbling. "These will be critical to your success. If you do not arrive at the tower within 48 hours, you will be disqualified. If you arrive at the tower without a scroll, you will be disqualified." His smile grew even wider, screwing his eyes up and transitioning from good humor to almost mocking. "If you arrive with 2 scrolls, you will be disqualified. To pass the test, you must present both a heaven," he pointed at one symbol, and then the other, and an earth scroll at the tower. "There are 5 of each here, obviously. So only 5 teams would pass the test? Less than a fourth of those present?" Sakura blinked, realizing her error. "Wait, no. It was dash. If you show up with both scrolls, you get DQ'd." One of the shinobi from Sand asked, and Choza ponderously nodded. The boy cocked his head, the large object wrapped in bandages on his back shifting slightly with the motion. "But you can't pass unless you present both scrolls." "Precisely," Choza grinned. "Glad you understand." "Oh." Sakura murmured, and Sasuke looked over at her curiously. "What?" he mouthed, and Naruto caught the motion and looked too. Sakura looked back and forth between them. "Team up," she mouthed, and she saw the same realization strike her teammates. It was obvious, if they couldn't hold both scrolls themselves but they needed both to pass the test, they'd have no choice but to work with another team with an opposite scroll. They'd both arrive at the tower and present their scrolls simultaneously. That was the only answer to the paradox. Sakura looked around. There were 6 Konoha teams, Hinata's, Ino's, Tenten's, and 2 more that she didn't know. That meant that with some luck and coordination, all of the Leaf teams could pass and leave just 4 from the other villages. Was that on purpose? She saw the other shinobi looking around, a couple coming to the same conclusion. The girl from Rain nudged her teammate once more, and the boy from Sand turned around, regarding everyone with his dead green eyes. They'd both figured it out, Sakura was sure. More would follow. She doubted anyone wouldn't understand by the time the test really started. 10 of you will start with scrolls, Choza said, closing his palm. The other 12 will be released into the forest early. You will have 20 minutes to get a head start. 20 minutes to set traps, he meant. Going to the center was pointless if you didn't have a scroll. The test was encouraging teamwork among multiple teams, preparing defenses and ambushes, and advancing into hostile territory, all at the same time. Sakura had to admit it was a little clever. Everyone understand? Great. Choza said, not waiting for an answer. You. He pointed in turn to 10 different people, randomly scattered throughout the crowd. Come forward. Everyone else. He turned and lumbered off towards the main gate that led into the forest, flicking it open. Chunin stepped out from behind it, none Sakura recognized. 1 minute between each, 20 minutes start when the last of you enters. He bowed. Have fun. Of the 10 people called forward, 3 of them were Konohagakuer teams. It wasn't an unfair distribution, likely on purpose. Sakura was sure the village didn't want a nasty reputation for rigging the test against foreign genin. She recognized Lee, Hinata, and Shikamaru. The 2 leaf teams she didn't know, along with her and her teammates, would be getting the head start. A group from the Land of Rivers was the first to leave, immediately leaping up into the enormous trees and vanishing, and Sakura did her best to ignore the butterflies in her stomach. The rain shinobi that had been watching them were staying behind. They'd been selected for a scroll. The team from Sand, on the other hand, was waiting by the gate with them. The boy with the gourd was only 10 feet away. The moment Sakura began to think she was glad he wasn't acknowledging their existence, he turned around. You, he said, staring at Naruto. His teammates shifted at his side, and he glanced at them. They stilled. You're the Yondaime Hokage's son, aren't you? His eyes gained a spark of life, but somehow that only made them worse. Naruto Namikaze. Do know any others, Naruto said, crossing his arms, and the boy smiled. I am Gaara, of the desert, he said. His teeth were very white. The son of the Yondaime Kazekage. I'm probably meant to kill you, right? Naruto started, and one of the Chunin stepped forward. All right, too creepy, he said. You guys, go, into the forest. Get. Team 7 took the invitation gladly, rushing into the forest and following the example set by the team from River. They jumped up into the trees, losing themselves in the canopy. The trees were huge and thick, and the shadows they cast were nearly absolute. What the fuck? Naruto asked when they'd gained a decent amount of distance from the gate, turning back and looking where they'd come from, like he expected Gaara to be right behind them. What was that? He's crazy, Sasuke grunted. We're staying out of his way. I think we can all agree we don't want any of that. They came to rest on a branch, so large and wide that it could have passed for a street if it weren't hundreds of feet in the air. Most of the trees in the forest were founding trees, still green and always growing. Sakura doubted there was another forest like it in the world, but to anyone from Konoha, it would feel familiar, if not friendly. A home field advantage. Crazy doesn't cover it, Naruto muttered. What the hell is the Kazekage teaching his kids? Who knows? Sakura shivered. Sasuke's right, let's just avoid him. He's not starting with a scroll, hopefully it will stay that way. So, what's the plan? Naruto squatted down on the branch, looking around the forest. Visibility was low, Sakura thought. The trees were so thick and the shadows so thick that you were lucky to have a clear line of sight that went farther than 100 meters. 10 kilometers to the center wasn't far for a shinobi, but it was a lot longer than it seemed in an environment like this. 10 teams with scrolls, Sasuke said to himself. And 3 of them from Konoha. Hinata and Tenten's teams both have the Byakugan, Sakura said. They'd be a big help. If it's possible, we should try to team up with one of them and then track down whatever scroll they don't have. Team 10's probably thinking the same thing, Naruto mused. No, they've got Shikamaru, they're definitely thinking something smarter. They'll probably team up with Guy's team right away and just head right for the tower. Niji's too damn strong for them not to. You're right, Sasuke nodded, and Sakura smiled. There was a simple joy in working together. So, we'll be looking for teammate. They're the most likely candidate. We've got more than 20 minutes, Sakura said. We should get to know the area a little. It's probably going to be chaotic at first, with everyone getting released into the same section. It'll help if we know what's where. Sasuke nodded. Good idea. Stay within sight of each other, other teams will be showing up soon. We don't want to get in any pointless fights. He pointed a thumb over his shoulder. I'll check by the entrance. He was taking the most dangerous position, Sakura thought. It made sense, Sasuke was the best of them in a one-on-one fight. I'll check around here then, Naruto said. Sakura, you okay with going deeper? She gave him a thumbs up, and he smiled. Awesome. Like Sasuke said, let's stay in sight. They spread out, moving along the trees like bizarre spiders, clinging to the bark with their chakra. Sakura looked around. The forest was like a three-dimensional maze, both horizontally and vertically, thanks to the sheer number and size of branches that protrude from every tree. Even a normal person without ninja training could probably make it a fair distance into the forest without ever touching the ground, the canopy was that dense. She looked back, and found Naruto's blonde hair a reassuring speck of color in the dark greens and grays of the forest. It would be incredibly easy to ambush others, and be ambushed in turn, in this environment. Sakura could see and hear wildlife as well. Far below, there was crashing as the underbrush was crushed underfoot by something large and fast. The trees were dotted in bits of dead bark and circular holes. Sakura wasn't sure what could have left those, but after some looking she found her answer. A leech the size of her arm with 3 sets of fly-like wings was suckling on a branch below her, blindly gnawing at the bark. Gross. Sakura wasn't sure if those things fed on blood as well, but she wouldn't be surprised. She resolved to avoid them no matter what. Maybe they could be used on another team, though. She wasn't sure what made her look up. It wasn't a definite feeling or instinct. Nothing went through her peripheral vision. It was mostly happenstance. But nonetheless, she jerked her head up, and realized someone was watching her. There was a man standing on a branch less than 50 feet away, separated from her by the thick air of the forest. It wasn't another genin. He looked like a Chunin supervisor, Sakura thought. He was wearing the standard uniform and vest of one, though his long black hair kept the uniform from looking purely professional. It was bound up by a leaf he tied that he wore like a bandana. She was sure there were other ninja in the forest observing the exam. But were they supposed to be seen? Subconsciously, she started reaching for her sword. It was only when her hand settled on the hilt that she started wondering why. Are you Sakura Harino? The man's voice was gentle, but it carried over the divide effortlessly. Sakura nodded, and he leapt over to her branch, landing without a sound. He was handsome, Sakura thought, despite the deep frown lines that ran down his cheeks. His face reminded her of someone. It was only now that he was closer that she realized that missing 2 fingers from his left hand, his pinky finger was gone entirely, and his ring finger ended at the first joint. He looked like an Uchiha, she realized, and like Sasuke in particular. Not even close to identical, but there was a definite resemblance. Who are you? She asked, not taking her hand off her sword. A proctor, the man said, and Sakura marginally relaxed. He'd startled her, but his voice and mane was calm, maybe even protective. She didn't get any sense of threat from him. I've got something important to tell your team. Would you mind calling them over? The last of the groups have just entered the forest, we won't have much time. Sakura raised an eyebrow. Naruto? She called. Sasuke. Then, more quietly, you're not cheating or something, are you? Because we don't want the help. We can do this on our own. The man laughed. I'm sure you can. Don't worry, I won't help you. Sakura let go of her sword, and Naruto and Sasuke broke through the canopy behind her a second later. Sorry Sakura. Naruto called, still about 40 feet away. We didn't realize you were out of dash. He stopped, as though he'd run into a wall. Sakura turned, wondering what had happened, and found both Sasuke and Naruto staring at her. Sasuke was turning pale, his mouth moving but nothing coming out. "What?" she asked. "Sasuke, are you alright?" Something was wrong, her skin prickled. She realized she'd turned her back to the man, and found her hand wandering back to her sword. The hair on the back of her neck rose. Her teammate found his voice. "What?" he said, choking on something invisible. He snarled, and Sakura felt her heart jump at the expression. "What are you doing here?" A hand gently wrapped around Sakura's arm, and she froze, unable to shift it another inch. She couldn't reach her sword, she couldn't move at all. There was enormous strength in the 3 fingers resting on her. She knew in an instant that if the shinobi wanted to, he could snap her arm without much effort. She looked back, up at the man, and found his eyes swirling and red. They glanced down at her, and then fixed back on Sasuke. A Sharingan. He was an Uchiha. But if he was an Uchiha, Sakura thought, why was he grabbing her? Why was Sasuke so obviously terrified and shaking with rage? What was going on? "Just visiting," the Uchiha said. He smiled sincerely. "What kind of brother would I be if I didn't check up on you, Sasuke?" "Let her go," Naruto said. He was scared too, but Sakura was just confused. Sasuke had a brother? He'd never mentioned that to her. No one had. She'd assumed he was an only child, like her and Naruto. "Let her go right now." "Of course." The hand around Sakura's hand relaxed, but the man spoke again before she could step forward. "Don't move, Sakura." She didn't know what started it. She didn't try anything, and she was pretty sure the man behind her didn't move either. But Naruto and Sasuke glanced at one another, and then they both charged forward. It happened so fast that it was only in hindsight that Sakura understood what had happened. Something pushed her forward, not hard enough to hurt but enough to bring her down. She tumbled across the branch, rolling back to her feet, and the sound of a raise-non blew past her. Before she could finish her roll, there was a grunt and an explosion, and Sasuke yelled. Sakura came back to her feet, spinning and drawing her sword all in the same motion, and found Sasuke's brother unmoved, about 6 feet away. Naruto was buried in a small crater behind him, stunned and insensible, and Sasuke was face down on the branch, his left arm twisted behind his back. He was squirming, but his brother was kneeling on the small of his back as he held down Sasuke's right arm. He was twisting Sasuke's left farther and farther. Sasuke growled and bucked, but was completely unable to escape. Sakura's eyes went wide and she raised her sword into a ready position, rushing forward. She led with the blade, transforming her whole body in a spear aiming directly for the Uchiha's neck, and Sasuke's brother glanced at her. He released Sasuke's other arm, but it stayed stuck to the ground, as though his brother's shadow were grabbing it. His hand came up, the sword swept forward. He caught the blade between his thumb and index finger and Sakura came to an abrupt stop, grunting as her considerable momentum immediately vanished. She almost lost her grip on the hilt. They struggled to pull the blade back to attack again, but it was completely stuck. "Itake!" Sasuke shouted. "Don't touch dash!" Itake, Sasuke's brother, twisted one more time. Sakura heard a loud, clear snap, and Sasuke screamed, flailing his whole body and kicking at the branch fruitlessly. Naruto was groggily trying to get up, his hands scrabbling at the bark of the crater. "You're not ready," Itake said mildly. He looked down at his brother. Sakura was too afraid to drop her sword and attack without it. What could she do? She'd just end up like her teammates. "Still only 2 tomo? What have you been doing with your time?" Sasuke gasped. His arm flopped to his side, and Sakura felt nauseous at its limp movement. "I'm not like you," he said. "Oh?" Itake asked. "Interesting." "You bastard," Sasuke groaned. Itake pushed Sakura's sword back, releasing it. She should have struck again, but her heart was pounding so hard it felt like her entire body was shaking. She knew without a doubt that if she attacked, Itake would just break her arm too. Maybe worse. "You should drop out," Itake said, still sounding like a friendly proctor. Sakura was shaking. How could he sound like that right after breaking his brother's arm? He glanced at Sakura, and then at Naruto, still trying to work up the strength to get out of the crater. None of you are prepared to be Chunin. I'm doing this so I could find you, Sasuke said, still breathless with pain. I need to be strong enough. Well, I'm here, Itachi said. And you're not strong enough. There was a silence for a moment, and Sakura lowered her sword, wondering what she should do. Suddenly, Itachi stood up and backed away, jumping over Naruto. Sasuke slowly pulled himself to his feet, and Naruto managed to crawl out of the crater, shaking his head and looking over his shoulder at Itachi. I will be, Sasuke said, his voice low and full of anger. Itachi considered him. Acquire the third, he said suddenly. Is that all you want? Sasuke said. Sakura thought he sounded as though he might cry. That's it? My eyes. You shouldn't listen to mother, Itachi said with a frown. There's many things I want, but that isn't one of them. He took a step towards the side of the branch. Remember what I said? Leave the forest, this isn't your time. Drop dead, Sasuke snarled, and Itachi smiled. It was nice to see you, Sasuke. Until next time. He stepped off the branch without a sound, plummeting into the forest, and Team 7 was suddenly alone. Damn it! Sasuke fell to one knee, cradling his broken arm, and Sakura stepped forward, trying to get a better look at it. He swatted her away, a tear in one of his eyes. Damn it! Obito Sensei Chapter 13. Unexpected Allies. The splint was primitive, but it was the best Sakura and Naruto could manage. They'd fashioned it from some of the bandages they'd carried with them and two small branches, twigs compared to the trees around them. When it was in place and Sasuke's arm was immobilized, Sakura sat down, trying to figure out what had happened. Naruto sat with her, while Sasuke paced. Both her teammates had obvious bruises as well, Sasuke's on his other arm and Naruto's on his face. Sakura was the only one without a scratch. We have to go after him, Sasuke said eventually. Sakura looked at his arm, and then at him. And then what? Naruto asked. Get our asses kicked again. He shook his head. If we chase him, we'll be giving up the exam. That's just what he wants. Who cares about the exam? Sasuke demanded, pacing harder. He's going to. He stopped, his face twisting. I don't know what he's going to do. Sakura sighed. I don't understand what's happening, she said, and Naruto and Sasuke shared a look. She was reminded of how distant she'd felt when she'd first joined the team. She thought she'd been making inroads with both of them, and with their sensei, but here, now, with Sasuke's arm broken, she felt farther away than ever. You're just their teammate. Not their friend. She tried to crush the thought. It wasn't true. We never told you about Itachi. Naruto asked, and Sakura shook her head. He looked dumbstruck. My brother. Sasuke started, fumbling for the words. Sakura, that first day, when Obito came to us in the classroom and asked us about ourselves, I said I had something to attend to. Do you remember? Sakura nodded. She remembered the way Sasuke's face had gone sharp, turning from handsome to hateful for just a second. But she'd never asked. It hadn't been her place. Maybe they're not your friends because you don't act like they're yours. Shut up, Sakura told herself. This wasn't the time for that. When I was 7 years old, Itachi. Sasuke went quiet again, gazing at something Sakura couldn't see. She leaned forward a little, giving him a questioning look, and to her surprise Sasuke took a shuddering breath and remained quiet. He went crazy, Naruto cut in, and to Sakura it looked like Sasuke was almost grateful. She'd never seen him so uncertain. He went crazy and killed his dad, and Obito's brother, and a bunch of other Uchiha. He looked to Sasuke like he was asking for permission, and Sasuke nodded, confirming Sakura's suspicion. Almost half the clan. Sakura had always known that the Uchiha had suffered a tragedy. She'd always known that Sasuke's father was dead. Shinobi dying was a fact of life, and the clan had picked themselves back up and continued on with their lives. Sasuke had been quiet and bad-tempered for a whole year when they were young, and in hindsight she'd assumed that his father had died on a mission and that he'd been struggling with it. The way he'd overcome that sorrow had been what had made him so admirable to her, it's why she'd wanted to be on a team with him all those months ago. But, it had been Sasuke's brother? That's horrible, she whispered, and Naruto grimaced in agreement. Sasuke's family thinks that Itachi is going to come back for him, he said as Sasuke continued to stare into the distance. Sakura started as a memory cut across her mind, a serious, burned face regarding her with appraising eyes. I didn't realize. Sasuke's mom told me that. Sakura waved off Naruto's questioning look. Coming back to kill him too? She asked, trying not to think about how horrible the subject matter was. Why wouldn't he have when he was younger? Not to kill me, Sasuke said. He was pale. Sakura wasn't sure if it was because of the conversation or his arm. For my eyes. Sakura paused. You said something about that, she said slowly. You don't mean, literally. Sasuke nodded, his pacing had finally stopped. Have you ever wondered about Obito's title? What did that have to do with anything? Mangekyo no Obito? Sakura asked. Not really, she admitted after a moment. I didn't really see what a kaleidoscope had to do with it. I thought it might have to do with his sword and that white chakra it lets off, but I didn't really care. No, she told herself. It just wasn't important. She cared. Why would she think otherwise? He has that name because of his Sharingan, Sasuke said. That weird design his eyes have, that's a Mangekyo Sharingan. It's an evolution of the standard eye. Yeah, Naruto chimed in. 1 Tomo, 2, 3, that's normal. But the Mangekyo dash is something else entirely, Sasuke cut him off. He was a little less pale. Maybe talking was helping him take his mind off his arm. Only the most elite, like Obito and Itachi, can evolve it. But once you do, anytime you use your Sharingan, you start to go more and more blind. His lips twisted. This all used to be really secret clan stuff. But after Obito, it got out in the open, during the Third War. I don't know how. But if Sensei got his Mangekyo Sharingan that long ago, why isn't he blind? Sakura asked. Something wasn't adding up here. And how do you even know Itachi has a Mangekyo? Sasuke's mom and Obito both say so. And that's why Sasuke's family is worried about Itachi coming after him, Naruto said. I think I know why Obito isn't blind, Sasuke continued, clearly resisting the urge to start pacing again. If someone with the Mangekyo Sharingan implants the eyes of a close relative, ideally a sibling, those eyes will never degrade, while retaining the power of the old ones. He sounded like he was reciting something, Sakura thought. She got the feeling Sasuke had this rehearsed to him several times. So, super gross, Obito probably has his brother's eyes, Naruto said with a dour look. And the reason Itachi wants you to unlock a third Tomo? Sakura murmured, and Sasuke nodded. So that he can take my fully developed eyes, he said. That's what mother thinks. That's so creepy. Sakura couldn't think of anything better to say, and Naruto laughed at her bluntness. Yeah, he's a creep, he said. You saw that. He'd have to kill his own family like that. He glanced at Sasuke. We always figured he'd come after us, just not so soon. He frowned. I'm really sorry we didn't tell you. Maybe if dash. Don't worry about that, Sakura said. That's not what we should worry about right now. Yeah, Naruto acknowledged. I guess the real thing is if we should keep going or not. Sasuke sighed. You were right, Naruto. We can't catch up with him, he said, grimacing. Even if we'd chased him right away. He was always too fast. If he was going to kill anyone else, he would have done it before coming here, and if he's going after anyone, he'd get to them before we could. He sighed. I think he was being honest. He's just here for me. Then, he asked you to drop out, Sakura said. Do you think he meant it? No, Sasuke said. I don't know if it was reverse psychology or something else, but if he really wanted me to drop out, he would have done worse than break my arm. He rubbed his shoulder, wincing. He might not even have left. He might just be watching us, seeing what I'll do. Sakura tried not to show just how disconcerting she found that idea. He wants you to keep going, I bet, Naruto said with what he probably thought was a sage nod. There's no way he'd think you'd actually listen to him. You develop more tomo from challenges, right? From being stressed out. Sasuke nodded, and Naruto grinned. Well, doing the Chunin exam with a broken arm would definitely be that. This was all a game, Sakura thought. Sasuke's brother was playing a game with them. Now that Sasuke had raised the possibility, she was sure they were being watched, but she had no way of knowing if that was her instincts or just paranoia. In a forest like this, which had just filled up with over 60 ninja, more than just Itaka could be watching them. So, we should play along then, she said. Keep going, if that's what he wants. If that is what he wants, Sasuke repeated quietly. He could have really thought we should drop out. If he thought that, fuck him, Naruto declared, shooting to his feet. Sakura and I are both still fine, and you've still got one arm. We can still do this. What a contrast, Sakura thought. Naruto was always like that. He might have been hesitant to start the exam, but now that he was here he was going to give 110%. It was definitely one of his most admirable qualities. She smiled and stood up as well. It's up to you, Sasuke, she said. You're the one who's hurt. Sasuke looked at the both of them, and then out to the forest. TCH. He grunted, his nostrils flaring. Naruto's right. Fuck him. Sakura giggled. She'd never heard Sasuke swear before. If we're going to drop out, we should at least drop out trying. ####. Team 7 set out in search of Team 8, sticking to the treetops as they scanned the training ground. They didn't see any other competitors, but every once in a while, they could hear them. Distant yelling, the occasional scuffle, and once an explosion, either a jutsu or a detonating tag. Naruto had tied a message around his arm, written on a piece of bandage, Hinata. They'd hoped that the Byakugan would pick it up, and that the other Leaf team would come to them. That hadn't happened. 2 hours into the second test, Team 7 still hadn't seen a single other shinobi. Plenty of animals, including bugs the size of a grown man's arms and birds bigger than couches that hunted them, but no genin. We should start heading for the center, Sasuke said. He held his arm stiffly at his side. Sakura had seen him wince once or twice as they'd leapt from tree to tree and it had jostled against him. It's been too long, people are probably already heading towards the tower. Yeah, Naruto agreed, and Sakura nodded. If they weren't finding anyone or being found in turn, the main groups of teams must have already made their way past them. They'd been given 2 days to complete the test, but for most people, it wouldn't take nearly that long. They turned north, orienting towards the center of the forest, and moved off more slowly than they had before. They'd been skirting the southern edge of the training ground, hoping to catch anyone lingering near the entrances. By moving towards the center, they were advancing into potentially hostile territory. Without actively communicating, they fell into a standard triangular formation, with Naruto and Sakura at the front and Sasuke covering their rear, keeping about 10 meters apart as they advanced through the canopy. The forest was an amazing place, Sakura thought. It was both deceptively huge and amazingly dark. It was around noon, when it should have been brightest, but only a fraction of the sunlight managed to penetrate the enormous trees around them. Konoha might not have been so hidden anymore thanks to the demands of a modern industry and a population that enjoyed things like plastic and instant ramen, but when it had first been founded decades ago, it must have been impossible to find the village hidden in the leaves unless you knew exactly where to look. It was strange that the hidden villages were no longer truly hidden, that they were known factors that everyone planned for and understood, that were important parts of their nation's government, Sakura thought. She wasn't smart enough to call that good or bad, silly, or normal, just strange. Hold up. Naruto raised one of his hands, and Sakura and Sasuke both came to an immediate stop, resting against the sides of the trees closest to them. Sakura felt her chakra work its way into the bark of the tree, anchoring her in place, and marveled that something that had been so alien to her just months ago was now totally second nature. She hadn't even thought about sticking to the surface, she just had. Down below, Naruto whispered, and Sakura followed his line of sight just in time to catch a flicker of movement, black against the shadows of the forest. Someone had just relocated, about 80 meters away and 30 down. I think they saw us. We don't have a scroll, Sakura said. Why would they bother us? They don't know that, Sasuke said quietly, and Sakura resisted the urge to slap herself. Duh. How would they have known that? Any team was a potentially valuable target more than 2 hours in, there was no guarantee people who'd started without scrolls still didn't have any, or vice versa. What should we do? Naruto asked, and Sakura considered the problem. By now, that shinobi they'd seen could be anywhere. Go up? She asked. Harder to get surrounded that way. Sasuke shook his head. And easier to get cornered, he muttered, peeling his upper body off his tree. Use me. What do you mean? Naruto asked, and Sasuke stared at him like he was an idiot. As bait, he said with a smirk, shifting his broken arm slightly for emphasis. I'm a good target. I'll go out ahead, and try to get them to jump. Then, you guys jump them. That's dangerous. Sakura frowned, and Sasuke shrugged. Better than just waiting here. Sound good. Naruto and Sakura shared a glance, and Naruto sighed. Just be careful, okay? He said, and Sasuke grinned back. Of course, he said, and then he was off, tearing through the forest without looking back and descending in altitude. He can make a lot of noise, Naruto admitted. He was right, Sasuke wasn't dampening his footsteps with chakra, and he was raising a veritable cacophony leaping from tree to tree and tearing through smaller branches. There was no way the other team wouldn't notice him. I thought that was my thing. Well, maybe you can show him how it's done after this, Sakura said, and Naruto grinned at her. Come on, let's follow him. They went after Sasuke, silent and invisible in the trees, keeping about 100 meters behind their teammate. The subdued chase continued for about 30 seconds, and then Sasuke came to a stop. Sakura strained to see why through the cover provided by the trees, and found Sasuke perched on a branch, looking at something she couldn't see. His mouth was moving, she was pretty sure, he was speaking with someone. The way he held himself told her he wasn't frightened, but he was alert. The person who Naruto had seen, or one of their teammates, had probably confronted him. Let's go around, she told Naruto, and he nodded as they changed directions, heading towards whoever Sasuke was speaking with. They went in a slight arc, so they'd approach from the rear. Where's the rest of you? She heard Sasuke say, his voice faint, when they were within 50 meters. They're around. Sakura thought she recognized the voice that answered. It was a boy, a cocky one. It wasn't someone she knew, but the tone was familiar. What about yours? They're around, Sasuke retorted, and there was a rustle of leaves. Sakura came out from behind a tree and finally saw who he was speaking with. It was the boy from Rain, the one with shark teeth. The Aimnin was standing on a branch above Sasuke, looking down at him with his arms crossed. His teammates were nowhere in sight. Sounds likely. The boy couldn't see Sakura and Naruto approaching from behind him, fixated on Sasuke. Sakura looked at Naruto, tapping the hilt of her sword, and she was pretty sure he understood right away, if she was the one to attack, she might kill him, and they didn't want that. Taking him down was going to be Naruto's responsibility. You're probably bait, right dash? Naruto pushed off his tree, hard, to cover the last 30 meters, and the enemy shinobi must have heard something. He turned around just in time for Naruto's foot to connect with his neck. To his credit, Naruto didn't yell gotcha, or anything else that Sakura had expected him to say. But that was probably because when his kick took the Aimnin in the throat, the boy's upper body exploded into water. So instead of knocking the shinobi out, Naruto let out a surprised yelp and soared straight through his opponent, over Sasuke, and directly into an inconveniently placed tree, burying his foot in its bark. Wow! The boy uncrossed his arms and laughed, looking back to Naruto. He hadn't seen Sakura. She unsheathed her sword, mind whirling. Was he a clone made of water, or was that some sort of jutsu? Either way, he probably wouldn't die if she cut him. Her knuckles went white as her grip tightened. Little dramatic, don't you think? Sakura didn't make a sound, she just leapt and swung in the same motion, landing on the tree besides the boy and spinning to face him. He glanced at her, and his head fell off. Sakura had thought that maybe if she'd separated his head, he wouldn't be able to pull the same trick, but that wasn't the case. He caught it in one hand before it could hit the branch. "Heh, it is you guys," he said, raising it back up and making an exaggerated motion of screwing it back onto his neck. His body flowed, melting into water for a second and then solidifying once more. "I told you, Leaf Shinobi got no idea how to treat guests. You're made of water," Naruto shouted, struggling to free his foot from the tree. "That's not fair. There's no such thing as fair when it comes to shinobi." Another voice came from higher above them, and Sakura glanced up to find one of the boy's teammates looking down at them, the boy with gray hair and glasses. He smirked. That was a good attempt though, he'd be unconscious and dead if he weren't cheating. They were in trouble. Sakura backed up, raising her sword. One opponent right in front of her, another above and to the right, and the third one nowhere to be seen. Her hand was shaking a little, and she placed her other one on the sword as well, steadying it. "We don't have a scroll," she said, and the boy grinned. "If that's what you're wondering, there's no point in us fighting." "I already told him," Sasuke said. "Apparently, they don't care." "It's true." Sakura spun, there was a new voice, soft and gentle, coming from right behind her. She jumped away, down to Sasuke's branch and put her back to him, looking up where she'd come from. The third rain ninja was there, the one with the black and red Haori. She looked down at them, her brown eyes sharp. "We don't care if you have a scroll." She smiled, and to Sakura it seemed totally genuine. "In fact, it's lucky that you don't." "What do you mean?" Naruto had finally gotten his leg unstuck and he was standing on the side of the tree, rotating to keep all three of the enemy ninja in view. What were their odds, Sakura wondered. They clearly just wanted a fight. The guy made of water would have to be Sasuke's problem, he was the only one with fire jutsu. What if the others? Her train of thought was entirely derailed, in the same manner of something falling off a table and exploding when it hit the ground, when the girl above them took something out of the folds of her Haori and tossed it down to them. Sasuke caught it instinctively with his unbroken arm, and he and Sakura glanced at it, neither able to believe what they were seeing. It was a scroll, emblazoned with the symbol of heaven. "What?" Sasuke asked, looking at the scroll again and then up at the rain ninja. The boy smirked at him. "What?" he asked again. "Why? We were lucky enough to come into 2 scrolls early on," the boy with glasses said, leaping down to join his teammates. He produced an earth scroll with a grin. "But it's not much good to have both without someone to hand it in with, is it? You didn't work with the team that had the other?" Sasuke asked suspiciously, and the girl shrugged. "They didn't want to cooperate," she said. "We thought it would be simpler to find someone who would." "Lucky you." The other boy smiled, revealing his shark teeth. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, you know, getting to team up with us, we're gonna pass this exam for sure. You gonna be smart enough to take it? What if you just take us out like you did the other team?" Naruto asked, narrowing his eyes, and the girl laughed. "We could," she said. "It would be easy, with one of you hurt." Sasuke Uchiha, right? Sasuke started at his name, and the girl waved him off. "Don't worry, you're a little famous, you know. Who managed to break your arm like that?" "Doesn't matter," Sasuke said, and the girl shrugged. "Kabuto?" she asked, and the boy with glasses jumped down to their branch. Sakura leveled her sword at him, and he raised his hands with a disarming grin. "Look, no funny business, all right," he said, showing his empty hands. That didn't mean anything, a ninja's hands could be their deadliest weapon. He walked forward slowly. "Put it to my neck if you want, I don't really care." He looked at Sasuke. "Do you mind if I take a look at your arm?" Sasuke glanced at her, and Sakura took Kabuto's advice, putting her sword to his neck. He just shrugged. What if he was made of water too? Even if he wasn't, could she cut someone's head off knowing for sure it would kill them? Sakura wasn't sure she had it in her. Kabuto continued to walk slowly forward. "I'm not gonna touch you," he said. "I've got medical training. We just wanna show we're serious." If you consider teaming up, I'll fix up that arm for you. Sasuke frowned suspiciously. Prove it. You heard him, Naruto threatened from above, and I'll smash you into a million pieces. I wouldn't dream of it, Kabuto said, and Sakura had no idea if he was being sarcastic or not. He gingerly reached out, looking at Sasuke for permission, and hesitatingly, Sakura's teammate extended his broken arm. Kabuto ran his hand over it, a faint green glow issuing from his palm. It's a clean break, he muttered after a second. It would heal quickly even without my help. He looked up. Do you mind if I touch it? If you want. Remember, you've got a sword at your neck, Sasuke said, and Kabuto laughed, glancing at Sakura. Hard to forget. Steady hands, though. Have you ever cut someone with that? Sakura didn't answer. If she lied, she'd look like a fool. If she told the truth, it would be even worse. Kabuto didn't seem to mind the lack of response. He reached out with both hands, fingers making contact with Sasuke's skin, and the Uchiha flinched. The Rain Shinobi's palms began glowing again, and he traced them up and down Sasuke's arm, leaving trails of iridescent green chakra that sunk into Sasuke's skin. Does it hurt? Sakura asked. She'd never seen medical jutsu before. Sasuke shook his head. It's warm, he said. I think. Just give me a minute, Kabuto said, and Sasuke did, letting him run his hand up and down the arm twice more, focusing on the elbow. Okay. He released Sasuke's arm and then, to Sakura's shock, gave it a slap. Her teammate barely reacted. Any pain? No, Sasuke said. Doesn't hurt at all? Cool. Kabuto grinned. Good as new then. That's totally amazing. Naruto had been watching the whole thing with wide eyes and now he was smiling, totally taken in by the display. Hey, thanks. If you're being serious, we'll be happy to team up with you guys. Naruto. Sakura shouted up at him, and he looked down at her with a confused expression. Are you sure about that? If they're willing to fix Sasuke, Naruto said, why shouldn't we? You wanna pass, right? The other boy from Rain said. You shouldn't stick your nose up at help. Sakura looked back and forth between both her teammates. Naruto was enthusiastic, but Sasuke was just quiet. He was probably thinking the same thing as her, she thought. Even if this was some sort of trick, they could at least use this team to get themselves farther. Just fighting them and taking both their scrolls wouldn't be the smart move. There was no guarantee they'd win. Passing with the team from Rain would be better than losing without them. Alright, she decided after a moment, lowering her sword from Kabuto's neck. He adjusted his glasses, still looking unruffled. Sorry about that. Nothing to apologize for, he said good-naturedly. I'm sure I would have done the same thing, in your situation. He stuck out his hand, open and inviting. Want to start over? Sakura regarded his hand, but Sasuke was the first to take it. Sasuke Uchiha, he said. Though it sounds like you already know me. Kabuto Yakushi, Kabuto said with a firm shake. It's a pleasure, Sasuke. He pointed up at his teammates. My friends up there dash. Suigestu Hojiki. The other boy called down with a grin. You can let me introduce myself, you know. Kabuto laughed. Of course. My apologies. He surrendered with an overly dramatic wave of his hand. I'm Naruto Namikaze. Sakura's teammate called out. And she's Sakura Haruno. He looked at the last Rain ninja, waiting for a name. And what about you? The girl gave him a gentle smile. I am Hakuyuki, she said. It's nice to meet you all. I hope we can complete this together. Haku, that was the name of the shinobi who'd been watching them since before the first test. She seemed kind, but looking around, Sakura was sure that them meeting up more than 2 hours into the test like this wasn't a coincidence. The team from Rain had already had both scrolls. It was like they'd been looking for them. That couldn't be it, right? There was no way they could have known the second test would involve working with another team ahead of time. But maybe once they had. Who would want to team up with you? Sakura. Naruto asked. You alright? Yeah, she said. Yeah. She tried to smile. It's nice to meet you all. Likewise, Haku said. She gestured to the east. There's a river heading north, we think towards the tower at the center. We were following it before we ran into you. Shall we? Sasuke nodded, and Team 7 left with the team from Rain, making their way towards the river in an uncertain future. Obito Sensei Chapter 14. Picking up the sword. It only took them 5 minutes to find the river, and when they did they turned north, following it towards the center of the forest. As they walked along it, Sakura wondered how long the team from Rain had been following them before they'd been noticed. The two teams had naturally fallen into a modified triangle formation. Sakura and Haku walked together on the banks of the river, and Suijutsu and Sasuke formed the vanguard up ahead. Naruto and Kabuto were both walking on the river itself, completing the triangle. It hadn't been a verbal agreement for them to pair up team by team, but it made sense. Each of them wanted to keep an eye on the other. Haku was quiet, but her teammates were not. The girl had a kind of severe beauty, Sakura thought, but now that they'd been walking side by side for some time, she'd begun to notice that Haku was more androgynous than she'd seemed at first appearance. The other ninja had a couple inches on her. She was about the same size as Tenten, and probably close to her in age. Down in the river, Naruto and Kabuto were talking. How'd you learn it? Her teammate asked. Sakura couldn't see them over the lip of the bank, but she could hear them despite their hushed tones. The Forest of Death wasn't a quiet place, with the constant sound of wind rustling the trees and distant and not so distant animals, not to mention the rushing of the river, but they were all still very aware they were in potential enemy territory. I started when I was young, Kabuto answered. The bespectacled shinobi had a calm, warm tone, but Sakura thought something sounded off about him. Everything he said was carefully constructed. Maybe that was just how he was. My mother taught me. Your mom's a shinobi too. Sakura let her mind drift a little as she listened to the conversation, keeping a lookout on the forest. She's not by birth. I didn't know my birth parents. She found me on a battlefield. Oh. I'm really sorry. That's terrible. It wasn't one created by the leaf. No need to worry about it. I didn't think about that. Why would you? So she was a medical ninja, huh? Yes. A shuffle. Someone had kicked the water. Probably Naruto. She knew that I wanted to help people like she had, so she taught me her jutsu. By the time we arrived at Omegakure, I knew most of it. You weren't born in Rain. That was pretty interesting, Sakura thought. So far as she knew, villages didn't generally take in foreign ninja. She definitely didn't know of any leaf ninja from another village or even country. Maybe there were and she just didn't know. No, but when we arrived they took us in without question. Rain's like that. That sounds pretty nice. Is that why you teamed up with us? What do you mean? I mean, it sounds like you guys are taught to get along with people. Kabuto laughed. I guess so. Mostly we were just desperate for someone to work with. We're the first shinobi from Rain that have gone to a Chunin exam in many years, we don't want to fail. Well, you picked the right team then. Sakura couldn't see Naruto's grin, but it still made her feel a little warmer as the forest cooled down. The day was winding on, the sun growing lower. We're hoping to win too. Is this your first try? A momentary silence, maybe a nod. That's impressive. I don't know if I'd be that confident at your age. Even with your medical jutsu. Naruto sounded skeptical. How does that work, anyway? It seems pretty crazy to just fix a broken bone like that. No crazier than a broken bone healing on its own, Kabuto said, and Sakura nodded along. Haku glanced at the small motion with an equally small smile, and Sakura felt a flash of embarrassment. That's all most medical jutsu does. Makes it heal on its own. Naruto asked. What do ya mean? Well, your body's got its own natural healing process, Kabuto explained. It can change depending on your chakra for some people, but in general humans all generally heal up the same way. I'm sure you know that. Duh. Naruto was probably rolling his eyes. Sakura wondered if he had given Sasuke that habit, or if it was the other way around. Well, basic medical jutsu like the kind I can use just convinces the body to heal itself faster, with some extra help. It's a little like genjutsu, I guess. Kabuto's voice grew slightly more official. It was the voice of a teacher. The boy wasn't much older than them, but Sakura was suddenly sure he'd told other people the same thing. The medic sends their own chakra into the recipient, though too much can induce chakra shock. That's an offensive technique, so it's not much use to me. I don't like fighting. Why not? I saw too much when I was young, I suppose. Naruto clearly didn't know how to answer that as Kabuto continued. So the medic's chakra enters the body, and like a genjutsu, initiates a response. In this case, it tricks the body into thinking that it has more than enough chakra to produce new cells rapidly to speed up the healing process. Something like a broken bone fixes itself by producing a hematoma, which then... He trailed off. If Sakura had to guess, Naruto was giving him a confused look. He'd never been one for anatomy books. I won't get too technical, Kabuto decided with a laugh. The point is, normally it'll take weeks to a month for the blood clot to draw enough new cells in that will become healthy bone cells, but medical jutsu tells the body and its chakra to do that with increased speed, and provides the extra energy. That's pretty incredible, Naruto said. You've gotta have crazy chakra control. And know everything about the natural process, or else things will go wrong, Kabuto acknowledged. They're difficult techniques to learn, but worth it. Fixing people up is definitely really awesome, Naruto said. Yes, Kabuto said, sounding a little wistful. It means putting other people ahead of yourself. That's what being a medic ninja is. Naruto hummed, and Sakura wondered what he was thinking. They walked another 30 minutes in silence, moving slowly and quietly. They could just have rushed to the center through the treetops, Sakura thought, but the team from Rain had the right idea. Following the river along the forest floor was both stealthier and made it easier to not get lost. The water flowed inexorably north. You're smart not to trust us. When Haku finally spoke in her soft voice, Sakura almost tripped over her own feet in surprise. The shinobi at her side had been totally quiet for so long that Sakura had begun to think she'd never speak at all. She glanced over at the Rain shinobi, wondering what had driven her to talk. What do you mean? She asked, and Haku cocked her head, a light smile flitting across her face. Shinobi can be cruel, she said, and Sakura narrowed her eyes, wondering what was coming. Even if we helped you, that doesn't free us from suspicion. Are you calling my teammates dumb? Sakura asked, and Haku laughed. No, nothing like that, she said. I think they have good instincts, they all understand the situation. I was just trying to compliment you. I'm not sure if I should thank you, Sakura said. Haku's smile faded. My apologies, she said. I didn't intend to offend. Sakura felt herself deflate a little, that familiar embarrassment creeping back. Why are you being so ungrateful? They're helping you win. I'm sorry, she said. After Sasuke's arm got broken, we didn't expect anyone to help us. I understand, Haku said, looking forward to the Uchiha. He and Suijutsu were arguing about something, but Sakura couldn't tell what. Sasuke didn't look angry, if anything, he looked like he was having fun. She wondered what they were talking about. I would have thought the same in your position. She glanced back to Sakura. What managed to break his arm, anyway? We were told to watch out for Sasuke Uchiha, that he was one of the most dangerous genin in this exam. That was probably why they'd teamed up with him, Sakura thought. Better to be Sasuke's friend, and Naruto's, than their enemy. That made sense. You weren't part of the equation. It wasn't another genin, Sakura said, and Haku blinked. I don't think I can say more than that. Ask him yourself if you want to know. Interesting, Haku murmured. She grinned. And perhaps a little ominous. They walked in a more comfortable silence for a couple minutes after that. This time, Sakura was the one to break it. Was it actually a coincidence, she asked, that you ran into us? Haku looked over at her, and didn't answer right away. You said you were told to watch out for Sasuke, Sakura said, and gestured towards the river. And Naruto's on the team too, the Hokage's son. You must have been warned about him too. Yes, Haku acknowledged gracefully. We were told the both of them were extremely capable. She looked Sakura up and down. I'm surprised we weren't told the same for you. Your chakra control, and your kenjutsu, were both excellent. You would have killed Suijutsu if it weren't for his jutsu. None of us noticed you coming until the last moment. I don't think I could have if I hadn't known about that water jutsu, Sakura said, the admission slipping out as she refused to acknowledge the compliment. I've never killed someone. That's good, Haku said. Killing someone is a terrible crime. Sakura blinked. You're a shinobi, she said, stating the obvious. Do you really believe that? Of course. Haku spoke with such certainty that Sakura felt for a moment the older girl possessed a secret, or understood something on a deeper level than Sakura could hope at. She sounded convincing in just 2 empty words. If you end someone else's life, they're gone forever. You've wiped out everything they were and everything they could ever be. Surely, you could only do something like that with the most drastic justifications. Sakura didn't know what to say. She'd never heard anyone say anything like that. She'd been taught since before she could even remember that sometimes, you needed to kill someone to live. Her parents, her school, all her friends, they'd all told her the same thing. You could protect the will of fire by killing those who sought to suffocate it, and protect it with your own life. She couldn't conceive of something outside of that. But she couldn't say Haku was wrong, because as Sakura considered it, she came to understand that the strange shinobi from Rain was totally correct. I guess, she eventually said, internally cringing at the weakness of the answer. Haku smiled. You let me distract you, she said, and Sakura shook her head. I was gonna get back to it, she said, and the ninja from Rain grinned. I could keep it up, if you'd like, Haku said, and Sakura tried to resist the urge to laugh. I was going to ask next why you picked up a sword if you weren't sure if you could kill someone. That's a good question, Sakura admitted. But mine first. If you were told about both my teammates, was it really a coincidence that we were the ones you ran into? Yes, Haku said again, and Sakura wasn't sure if she believed her. We would have been happy to work with any team, but it was lucky we met up with yours. She gave Sakura a sly look. We were searching for a team to gift our spare scroll to, in the hopes it would make them trust us. I won't deny that. That makes sense, Sakura said, but she didn't believe her. Naruto and Sasuke were both too unique for this team from Rain to just happen to run into. Probably. It could happen. That's what coincidences are. You're just being paranoid. You can't believe that anyone would want to team up with you. Shut up. Sakura flinched, and Haku glanced at her in concern. She waved the other girl off. It's hard to believe, Haku admitted. I don't blame you if you don't. Sakura shrugged. It doesn't really matter if I do or not, she said. What matters is working together now to pass. That's practical. Haku smiled. How about this? I'll tell you a secret dash. Sakura held up her hand, stopping her. Down in the river, she heard Kabuto and Naruto stop as well. Up ahead, about 50 meters away, Sasuke was covertly signing something behind his back as he and Suijutsu continued chatting. The boy made of water was doing the same thing. She couldn't recognize whatever Suijutsu was signing, but Sasuke's sign was one of the dozens of simple hand language signs that all Konoha shinobi learned as children. Enemy, he signed quickly, 3 times. Ahead. 3. Haku muttered, and Sakura confirmed with a nod. Sasuke and Suijutsu were signing the same thing. Only one team. What should we dash? Sakura started to ask, and then the earth erupted. A huge wave of earth exploded up out of the ground below Sasuke, throwing him away and out of sight, and hurtled forward along the bank of the river towards Sakura and Haku. They both tensed, watching the jutsu come, and Sakura backed up in shock. It was like a mobile mud wall, over 20 feet tall and moving several hundred miles per hour. Getting it by it would hurt, without a doubt. Haku grunted and jumped, and Sakura followed her into the air, trying to gain distance. The mud tsunami rolled by beneath them. It was thicker than Sakura had thought, maybe 30 feet deep. She looked around for Naruto and Kabuto, but they weren't in the river anymore. Before she could catch her breath and decide on where she would land, 3 dozen shinobi all leapt out of the tsunami, eyes fixed on her and Haku as they emerged from the jutsu. They were all the same person, one of the girls with long black hair from the village hidden in stone. They were all holding short swords, Tonto. Clones, Haku noted. There was a frozen moment as the clones watched them. They'd been caught totally flat-footed, unable to maneuver. The enemy team had been trying to force them to jump. The rain shinobi looked over at her, and a dozen senbon fell out of her sleeve, 2 each resting between her fingers in both hands. She spoke, perfectly calm. The clones jumped up at them. No reason to worry about cutting them down. Sakura shivered, feeling as though the words had physically struck her. Without a conscious thought, her hands found her sword. 36 shinobi attacked them at once, but they were slow. Everything was slow. Sakura drew her blade so quickly she didn't even notice it leaping into her hand. The first clone reached her less than a half-second later, and Sakura cut it in half, watching as it crumbled to dust, along with the sword in its hand. Clones made of earth. That made sense. She stopped thinking and started swinging as she fell into the massive ninja. 3 more came, each aiming their Tonto for a different limb, and Sakura deflected one blade, kicked another clone in the face, and impaled the last. She spun in the air, taking the upward momentum as her own, and pushed herself down, slipping past most of the attackers. One lashed out at her at the last second, and their blade clipped her shoulder, barely cutting her. Looking up, Sakura could see Haku, the ninja from Rain had thrown all of her senbon, and then another clutch, and 7 clones were tumbling through the air, pierced and paralyzed. She was almost as accurate as Tenten, Sakura thought. Hitting that many targets in midair in freefall was crazy. The other clones were falling back down towards her, still over 20 of them, swords at the ready. Like hell. She heard a familiar yell, and her vision was suddenly dominated by orange and blonde as Naruto came out of nowhere, hitting her hard in the side and carrying her out of reach of the rest of the clones. Sakura tapped him and he dropped her. She tumbled out of his arms and rolled as she hit the ground, spinning around just in time to watch Naruto bare his teeth and hurl a couple stones he'd plucked from the ground up into the massive clones. One of the stones struck a clone in the temple. The rock caught fire, glowing kanji squirming across it, and all of the other stones lit up with the same light. "You picked the wrong team," Naruto announced, and then all the stones detonated, a series of explosions rippling out above Sakura. The blasts tore over a dozen clones apart, blowing them into earth and dust and raining rubble down on the riverbank. Sakura watched in awe. She'd known Naruto had been working on his jutsu shiki, and figuring out ways to turn other objects into explosive tags. But she'd never seen him do it so quickly, and with so many objects at once. There were still more than 10 clones left, and they landed about 15 feet away from Sakura and Naruto, watching them carefully. Haku landed behind them, and several turned around to keep her in sight. Naruto growled, and a raise-non grew in his hand. "Nicely done, Sakura." She didn't know where Kabuto had come from, but he was behind the 2 of them all of a sudden. He lay his hand on her shoulder, and Sakura felt the small cut on her shoulder knit itself closed. "We're glad you're safe, Naruto," Sakura said, giving Kabuto a nod. "Stay back. There's still a lot of them. Better to let them come to them, especially with Haku flanking them." The clones watched them, and one of them spat, the liquid turning to mud when it hit the ground. "You look just like him," the girl from Stone said, and the other clones nodded in agreement. Sakura wondered where the real one was. She didn't think she was among her clones. She almost hoped not. "It's disgusting." "What dash?" Naruto muttered, and then there was another explosion, one that completely dwarfed the ones Naruto had been responsible for. Sakura looked up, trying to keep an eye on the clones as well. It took her a second to understand what she was seeing. One of the founding trees was tipping. The tree, which had a trunk with a radius of 10 or 15 meters and doubtlessly weighed thousands and thousands of tons, which was many times older than Sakura herself, was tipping towards them. It started so slow it could barely be perceived and rapidly gained impossible speed, crashing through the canopy and destroying hundreds of branches as it fell directly towards them. Sakura felt her brain short-circuit at the sheer size, speed, and weight of the tree coming down on top of them. It was just too big to understand. The shadow completely devoured her. "Sakura! Move!" Naruto shouted, and the spell broke. Sakura yelped in shock and went left, towards the river, desperately trying to get out of the way of the tree. She jumped with all her strength, pushing herself away as fast as she could, and looked back as the tree came down on top of the short-lived battlefield. Everyone else had scattered, there were ninja everywhere, but none in the tree's shadow. In the moment before impact, stretched out to infinity, Sakura laughed. Sasuke was on the side of the plummeting tree, dueling someone. The moment Sakura looked back, he kicked the stone ninja in the throat and jumped away from the tree. He was kidding, right? Sakura couldn't suppress the giggle that wormed its way up through her throat. It felt like she was floating, suspended over the river. He had to be kidding. That was just too. Boom. The tree landed, the sound so loud and so violent that Sakura's whole body shuddered, all of her organs shaking and her heart jumping, and she tumbled backwards in shock. The impact threw up an enormous gust of wind, mixed with water, earth, mud, and dust, an explosion that coated everything for 100 meters around and filled the air with debris of every kind. Sakura landed and rolled backwards, her heart hammering in her chest. When she came to her feet, she couldn't see more than 3 feet in front of her. The dust and debris hung so heavily in the air that it was like she was in the middle of a storm. Where was everyone? Her ears were ringing. Sakura stepped forward, trying to orient herself. Her eyes stung with the dust, and she teared up, raising her sword. When she took another step, a pair of hands burst out of the ground and wrapped around her ankles. Sakura yelped and swung, and one of the hands pulled, yanking her off balance. Her swing missed, and she fell backwards, her feet sliding along the ground as the hands pulled her back and forth. A second later, she started to sink, her feet slipping under the ground. One of the hands jerked up, grabbing at her knee and drawing her deeper. She yelped, trying to swing again, and once again, was yanked off balance. She was going to get sucked underground. The shinobi was going to bury her. There was a shimmer in the dust, and a series of needles flew out of the dust. 4 of them buried themselves in the hand on Sakura's knee, and the last one missed, leaving a small cut in her leg. The hand suddenly withdrew, and Sakura stumbled, trying to regain her balance. She spun around, but the hands didn't come back. "Sakura!" Haku emerged from the dust, and Sakura backed up, keeping her distance. "What were you going to tell me?" she asked. The rain ninja could be one of the enemies wearing a henge, putting one up after all the pandemonium would be the perfect time. Haku smiled at her. "A secret," she said, and Sakura lowered her sword. "Sorry I scratched you." It was a difficult dash. The earth behind Haku erupted, and she flinched, starting to turn. Too slow. A girl with short black hair burst from the ground, knife at the ready, swinging down to bury the blade in Haku's head. Sakura watched the whole thing in shock. Haku's eyes went wide. Sakura's mind went blank. She lunged and swung, covering the distance between her and Haku in a heartbeat. Her whole body rotating with the blow, ankle to hip to shoulder, a clean arc. The stone ninja didn't have time to react. Sakura's sword clove a silvery trail through the dust, missing Haku's temple by inches. It struck the knife clean out of the enemy's hands, and took off the top joint of the ninja's middle finger. Blood sprayed over Haku's shoulder. The knife hit the dust and bounced. Haku finished turning, one leg sweeping the stone ninja's legs out from under her and the other hand coming up and slamming her down, directly into the ground. Sakura breathed out, the whole moment crashing into her at once, and time resumed. Haku came down on top of the enemy ninja like a sack of bricks, knocking the rest of her breath out, and pinned her there, wrapping around her like a constrictive snake. Sakura looked around. The ninja was bleeding. That meant it wasn't a clone. That one of the 3 was definitely down. "Thank you," Haku said quietly. She slid a needle into the shinobi's neck as she struggled beneath her, and the girl calmed down a little, slowly stilling. "Of course," Sakura said, scanning the dust. "Did you just The dust was slowly clearing, settling to the forest floor. Just paralyzed, Haku said. So long as it's removed properly. Sakura nodded, sure that another attack would come soon. Why, of course. She didn't consider it. She just said it. That's all there was to it. Kabuto. Haku called out, and there wasn't an immediate answer. Suijutsu. She must have thought that having a hostage put them at an advantage, Sakura thought. She was right. Naruto. Sakura echoed her. Sasuke. Are you out there? Here. Naruto stumbled out of the dust, with Kabuto at his side. He looked at the shinobi Haku was standing up from, and at the blood on Haku's haori. You alright? Yeah, Sakura said. It's her blood. Naruto looked a little surprised at that. The dust continued to settle, it was still hard to see, but Sakura could make out the great tree, lying on its side next to the river. There was a figure on top of it. Sakura squinted, and Naruto followed her line of sight. Sasuke. The figure gave her a thumbs up and a gust of wind whipped the dust between them away, revealing her teammate. Sasuke was standing on tall, atop another ninja. He had one foot on the small of the stone shinobi's back, pinning both the ninja's hands beneath it. I've got this one, Sasuke said calmly, his voice carrying over the river. Sakura walked a couple steps towards him and glanced down into the water, now clogged with mud and dust. Where's the last one then? She muttered, and then the river grinned at her. I was waiting for that, it burbled, and Suijutsu's smiling face surfaced, along with another sputtering shinobi. The last one was a boy, and he gasped and gagged, coughing up mud and thrashing as the river kept him captive. You always were too dramatic, Suijutsu, Kabuto said with a grin, walking up beside Sakura. I guess we got them all then. Man, Naruto groused. So we just fought clones. That's lame. He must have been talking about whatever he and Kabuto had done in the dust. They couldn't have won their fights if those clones were harassing them, Kabuto said, and Naruto glanced at him. I wouldn't worry too much. I guess, Naruto said, looking a little doubtful. The ninja Sasuke was pinning on the other side of the river squirmed, twisting her head to face him, her long hair whipping with the motion, that was the one that had created all the clones. You bastard, she snarled. Didn't get enough glory. Sasuke raised an eyebrow and stamped down on her, and the girl coughed, still glaring at them. So you were targeting us, he said, and the girl grinned up at him from the corner of her mouth. Did you really think you could go after the Hokage's-son like that? Depends what you mean, the girl sneered. Kill, no. The yellow flash wouldn't be happy with that. She looked back at Naruto with a disgusted expression. But teaching him a lesson. That was definitely possible, right? Sasuke shrugged. Guess not, he said, and before the ninja could do more than look offended he punched her in the back of the head, instantly knocking her out. Sasuke stepped back and picked up the shinobi's unconscious body, leaping over the river and landing in front of Sakura. Looks like we won, he said matter-of-factly, and Sakura didn't know what to do besides nod. The final stone shinobi was spat out of the river and landed next to them with a thud, still coughing up water, and Suijutsu slithered up the bank towards them, reforming into a boy near the top of the embankment. Nice, the boy grinned, his teeth too sharp as always. He kicked the prone ninja, rolling him over, and the boy gagged, finally clearing his throat. Shit, he coughed. I told them it was a bad idea. 2 teams at once. You were the one responsible for that earth wall, right? Kabuto asked him, and the boy nodded. That was really impressive. He was kneeling over the girl Haku had paralyzed with her senbon, green light playing over her hand. Your teammates are both pretty beat up. I've stopped this one's bleeding. The other's just unconscious. You see this? He pointed at the needle sticking out of the girl's neck, and the boy mutely nodded. He was slowly rising into a crouch, deliberately trying to project as little threat as possible. His dark eyes played over each of them in turn, fixing on Sakura's sword. There was still blood on it, she realized. Standing there, covered in dust and her sword stained in blood, she must have looked intimidating. It felt familiar. Like the merchants, she realized. Like the blood. But this was a shinobi, not a civilian. How could they be looking at her like that? This is just paralyzing her, Kabuto said, making the irony of his wording clear. If you pull it straight out, slowly, she'll be perfectly fine, a little numb for a while, but no permanent damage. Do you understand? The boy nodded again. Behind him, Suijutsu frowned. Do you have a scroll? He asked, and the stone ninja shook his head. We didn't start with one, he said. We were gonna grab one a while ago, but that team from Sand nabbed the team before we could dash. Okay, I don't want your life story, Suijutsu held his hands up mockingly. You should just get out of here then. You're too hurt to continue. He grinned, showing even more of his teeth. We'll let you off this time. But if you come after us again, we'll hurt you even worse. Get it? Yeah. The boy was shivering. How old was he, Sakura wondered. Maybe 14, 15. Older than her, but not by much. Got it. Cool. Suijutsu jerked his thumb. Then get out of here, you punk. The boy silently gathered up his two teammates, carrying them over both shoulders, and leapt away, heading south and higher into the forest. Suijutsu called after him. And hey, he said. When you get back to your hole in the ground, tell your folks that they shouldn't be worried about some yellow flash. That kinda thing is gone in a flash, they need to keep an eye on the nation of rain. The boy shot them a hateful look, and then he was gone, disappearing into the dimness of the forest. Well, that was fun. Sasuke didn't seem to know what to say. Thanks for the help, Suijutsu. My pleasure, the boy responded with his perpetual smile. You should have seen his face when I grabbed him. That shit was hilarious. That went well, considering, Kabuto said. Well, their mistake going after Sakura and Haku first, Naruto said, smiling at Sakura. She felt her stomach flip. They must have thought they were the easiest targets, you really showed them. Had she? She'd killed a couple clones with her sword, but besides that, Sakura hadn't felt like she'd done much. Naruto had taken more than a dozen out with a single jutsu. Still, she'd ignored enough compliments for one day. Thanks, Naruto. She smiled. You were amazing. I didn't know you'd gotten that jutsu to that level. I didn't either, he admitted with an uneasy grin. But when I saw all those girls trying to stab you, I guess. I got a little angry. He rubbed the back of his head. I didn't think it would be that big an explosion. Sakura didn't know what to say to that, and they fell into an awkward silence. Well, Haku said, dusting herself off. She glanced at the blood on her haori and swept it off, carrying it folded in her arms. We should continue. Yeah. Naruto said, seemingly grateful for the words. We should get going, we've gotta be close. The sun was setting behind Sakura, throwing him into sharp relief. It'll be dark soon, she noted. How long ago had it been noon? They couldn't have been walking for that many hours, could they? Had she really lost track of time so easily? Maybe we should stop for the night. You think? Naruto said, and Sasuke nodded. Most creatures hunt at night, he said. There are a lot of predators out there, and other teams besides. They gave us 48 hours, it won't hurt to use some of it. I agree, Kabuto said. I wouldn't mind resting before we reach the tower. There may be another test when we get there. I wouldn't put it past the examiners to push us right into it, to punish people who rushed ahead. Sakura hadn't considered that, but it definitely seemed possible for the exam to punish impatience. Sometimes, being a ninja meant being impossibly patient, waiting in one place for days at a time. That was the best explanation for the test, giving them 2 days to cover 10 kilometers. The forest was dangerous, but not that dangerous. It's a good idea, Haku said. Sakura looked back at her, wondering. In hindsight, she wasn't sure if Haku had needed saving from that final stone ninja. After Sakura had struck, she'd counterattacked instantly, and pinned the enemy in a moment. Her speed and reflexes were incredible. She could have saved herself. Was she just being paranoid again? Or simply putting herself down? Sakura wondered if she really had just saved someone and simply couldn't bring herself to accept it. She didn't know. As the others debated on where to camp out, Sakura glanced back at the setting sun, its light barely visible through the thick trees, and wondered how much she could trust herself. ####. They ended up farther up the river, in the canopy once again. The January sun set so fast that by the time they were arranged, it was already almost completely dark. Under the canopy of the Forest of Death, night was transformed into something infinitely blacker. The forest came to life as well. Below, Sakura could hear huge creatures rampaging around, feasting on one another. Being on the floor right now would be anything but pleasant. They'd decided to take shifts watching over the others, laid out across the branches and resting on their head on whatever was convenient. Naruto and Sasuke were both using their packs, with the knives removed and laid alongside them. Kabuto and Suijutsu had rolled up a spare shirt each and were using them as pillows. Shinobi were trained to be able to sleep in all sorts of conditions, but Sakura was still surprised at how readily her teammates had fallen asleep. They must have really trusted her to watch over them. You were being stupid. Like usual. You're their teammate. You're their friend. Why were you worried, stupid? Sakura looked out into the dark, pacing silently around the branch. If any of the other teams were moving at night, even if the pitch black, they'd be a tempting target. Haku was on the other side of the branch, and as Sakura paced near her, she glanced at what the other ninja was doing. Haku had her canteen out and her haori laid over her lap, and was gently moving her hands in a circle over the garment. As Sakura watched in astonishment, the water from her canteen swirled out, defying gravity, and slipped back and forth over the haori, gradually soaking up the dried blood. Circle, swish, circle, swish. Haku directed the water like a composer, washing up all the blood and leaving the haori spotless and black once again. She fluttered her fingers, and the minuscule clumps of dried blood in the water fell out as though they were suddenly lead. The water slipped back into the canteen as silently as it emerged, and Haku put the haori back on, tugging it into place. That's incredible, Sakura said quietly, and the girl glanced back at her. Just a chakra control trick, she said. I'm sure you could learn it. If you say so, Sakura said doubtfully. She paused. Haku. What? Haku asked, and Sakura shook her head. Asking was pointless. It was like she'd thought. She was being stupid. What's with the clouds? She asked instead, and the girl cocked her head. The red clouds. Did you make that design yourself? It's pretty. Haku laughed. No, I didn't make it myself. It's the mark of the Akatsuki. The Akatsuki? Sakura asked. Red Dawn, it meant nothing to her. Sit, if you'd like, Haku gestured, and Sakura did, putting her back to the darkness. Haku was watching and keeping her teammates in her line of sight. The Akatsuki is the group that rules the nation of Rain. They overthrew the old government some time ago. My sensei told me that, Sakura said, and Haku nodded. But you're not that old. You couldn't have been part of that Akatsuki. No, Haku acknowledged. But they're willing to accept new members. People who believe in their mission. In that way, wearing an Akatsuki cloak, she chuckled, lifting the cloth off her shoulder slightly, or a haori, tells the people of Rain that you're devoted. Devoted to what? Sakura asked. This sounded like the will of fire, almost. Every village had something different driving them, she thought. The Akatsuki must have been the village of Rains. If you want to know. Haku smiled, vibrant in the dark. I'll be happy to tell you. Check the description for the links to the author.